1960s, Edwin Booth was the man. He was this extremely famous American actor who basically anywhere he went in America, people would know who he was. He was extremely recognizable, a household name, an A-list celebrity through and through. But his acting prowess and his career and his fame, those are not the things we remember him for. In early 1865, when Edwin was 31 years old and was at the height of his acting fame, he walked into a New Jersey train station and walked through the building to the actual platform where the trains are. And as soon as he turned a corner and actually saw the train that he wanted to board, he very quickly realized that he probably was not going to get on that train. There was already this huge throng of people out on the platform pressed up against the side of this train, and they're all waving their arms around and yelling. And in the middle of this big group of people with his back pressed up against the train was the train's conductor, whose job was to sell tickets in addition to driving the train. But from Edwin's perspective, it seemed fairly obvious based on the conductor's body language and what some of the people in the crowd were yelling that there just weren't enough tickets. That's why this big unruly group had formed, because all these people were rushing forward trying to buy one of the last few tickets. Now, Edwin could have very easily just walked up and announced himself and shown his very famous face, and almost certainly he would have gotten a ticket. But to this point, Edwin had not been recognized in this train station, and so he wanted to keep a low profile, and so he decided against that idea. Instead, he decided he would just kind of join this big group and, try to flag down the conductor and try to buy one of these tickets, and if he didn't, so be it. And so Edwin, instead of going to the back of this group, he went around to the right side, close up against the side of the train, and right as he got to the outside of the group and he turned in towards the group, he looked up at where the conductor was, and he saw the conductor turning around and walking back into the train. He had clearly sold all of his tickets, and so anyone who had not purchased one yet, like Edwin, they were out of luck. They'd have to wait for the next train. Edwin was about to just walk away and wait for the next train when he noticed the crowd in front of him. They didn't disperse like he was doing. Instead, they all seemed to kind of surge forward towards the train, which was now moving. And as they pushed forward, as if they were going to jump onto this train, even though they didn't have tickets, one man who was towards the front of this group, right up against the train, he falls to the ground and gets trapped halfway under the train. His lower half was literally on the tracks under the train, and his upper half is now under this big crowd of people that are now trampling him. And so Edwin can see very clearly that if someone does not grab this guy and pull him out soon, he's gonna get run over by the train. And so Edwin, without any hesitation, he jumps forward onto the ground on the platform, and he reaches his hand out through the feet of all these people in this crowd, and he grabs the collar of the guy who had fallen, and he pulls him. And as he's pulling him, this guy who's on his back, he starts pushing with his legs and his feet, and within about a fraction of a second, they yank him out from under the train, and the guy who had fallen and Edwin are lying on their backs on the platform, and before they could even talk to each other, they sat up and watched as a big train wheel rolled over that piece of track where this guy had just been laying. Edwin had saved his life. The guy he had saved was a 21-year-old named Robert, and so the two of them, they stand up and they face each other for the first time, and when Robert sees Edwin, he gasps, because this is Edwin Booth, the mega celebrity. He could not believe that was the guy who had just saved him. And while Robert was very thankful, he also was just totally dumbfounded at the absurdity of the situation he was in. And so eventually Edwin just says, hey, I'm glad I was here to help you. No big deal. Next time be more careful. And then at some point the men just shook hands and parted ways. Edwin would eventually get on the next train and he would go wherever it was he needed to go. And before long, his very busy schedule kind of occupied his mind and he had kind of forgotten about what happened on the train platform. But a few days later, Edwin got a letter in the mail from a very high-ranking government official thanking him for saving Robert's life, because it would turn out Robert Lincoln was the eldest son of the then President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln. Now, to be clear, Edwin was extremely famous and had lots and lots of influence and knew lots of very important people, but he had never had any interaction with anyone in the Lincoln family before he met Robert on the train platform. So it was just a crazy coincidence that this mega celebrity happened to save the life of the president's son. But this coincidence was nothing compared to the coincidence that occurred next. On the evening of April 14th, 1865, so roughly 3 months after Edwin saved Robert, Robert's father, President Lincoln, sat down in a private seating area to watch a play at a Washington, D.C. theater. During the production at around 10:15 p.m., a man snuck into the private seating area and shot the president to death. The killer was Edwin's younger brother, John Wilkes Booth. This assassination had nothing to do with Edwin or his interaction with Robert on the train platform. This was an assassination that was formulated and carried out completely independently, meaning it was purely coincidence that just a few months after Edwin saved a Lincoln's life, his own brother took a Lincoln's life.
Next story.
With his wife and 2 daughters. While his life was not exactly exciting, it was good. He lived in a quiet and safe neighborhood, and Michael, who used to be a carpenter, was now semi-retired and got to spend the bulk of his time with his friends and family. But that year, something really started to bother him. 10 years prior, Michael had split up with his first wife, and after their divorce was finalized, his ex-wife and the daughter they had together, her name was Lisa and she was 21 at the time, those two stayed in the family home in Sudbury, England, and Michael moved south about an hour and a half to Bow, East London. The divorce had been quite messy, and so Michael had not only lost touch with his ex-wife, he had also lost touch with Lisa. And so fast forward 10 years back to 2007, and Michael and Lisa had not spoken since the divorce, and Michael found himself suddenly feeling this unbelievable wave of grief over the loss of his relationship with his first child. And so after speaking with his current wife and his 2 other daughters, he decided that he had to go find Lisa. He had to be reunited with her. The only problem was, he didn't know where Lisa lived, he didn't have her contact information, and he didn't know where his ex-wife was, so he couldn't even ask her how to get in touch with Lisa. However, he did have the street address of where they used to live in Sudbury, England, and so he decided that would be his starting point. So in August of that year, Michael and his 2 other younger daughters, they hopped in the car and they left Bow, East London, and they headed up to Sudbury. And when they got there, Michael navigated to his old street, which had brick houses lining each side of the road, and he drove down until he spotted his old house, and he parked right out front, and then he alone hopped out of the car, and he walked up to the front door, he took a deep breath, and then he knocked on the door. When the door opened, it was not Lisa, it was not his ex-wife, it was some other family that he didn't know, and they didn't know Lisa or his ex-wife, and so they said, good luck finding your daughter, but we don't have any information for you. And so Michael was crushed, but he thanked them, and he turned around, and he went back to the car, and he told his other daughters about what he had just learned, and then from there, the trio just kind of began driving around Sudbury, half looking for Lisa out on the streets, although none of them thought they would actually find her, and then also kind of discussing what they were going to do next, because now they had nothing. And so as they're driving around the streets of Sudbury, they come to the realization that their best bet at finding Lisa is putting some sort of story in the local newspaper that hopefully she would see, and then she would contact Michael. And so they drove to the headquarters of the local paper, the Suffolk Free Press, and they went inside and they managed to speak to a reporter. And after telling the reporter Michael's story about how he's lost touch with Lisa, the reporter thought, you know what, this is actually a pretty interesting story, and I'd be happy to do a small feature on you guys. And so the reporter, along with a photographer, brought Michael and his 2 daughters outside. They took a picture of them, and then they told Michael, in the next edition of the paper that will run in a couple of days, we'll run this picture along with a little write-up about how you're looking for Lisa, and we'll put your contact information in there, and hopefully she sees it and she reaches out to you, and you can be reunited and live happily ever after. And so Michael thanked the reporter and the photographer, and then he and his other 2 daughters hopped in the car and headed back to Bow, East London. In 2007, at the same time that Michael was beginning his search for Lisa, Lisa was actually beginning to think, you know what, I want to go find my dad. Lisa was now 31 years old. She had 3 kids of her own. She was married. She had moved out of Sudbury to a neighboring town. And she was thinking, I really want to have a relationship with my dad again so that my kids can have a relationship with him. And so she began speaking with her mother and with friends about how she should go about finding her dad. Because like Michael, she didn't have his contact information. She didn't have a phone number. She didn't know anyone who would. And then when she went on social media to look for him, he wasn't on there. And so she was kind of at a loss. Then one day in August, she was at her office and she was in the break room and she saw a copy of the Suffolk Free Press sitting out on the coffee table. So she picked it up and she began flipping through the pages, and then suddenly she stopped when she saw a picture of herself. She saw her and her mother walking along the streets of Sudbury. She had been in Sudbury just a couple of days ago to talk to her mom about finding her dad and kind of strategies for how to go about doing that. And then Lisa glanced at the caption for this photo and she nearly fell off of her chair. The man and the two girls who were the main focus of this photo that Lisa was in were her father and her two stepsisters. She just didn't recognize them. She just saw herself in the back of this photo. So purely by chance, after being apart for over a decade, on the only day that Lisa happened to be in Sudbury talking to her mom about finding her father, she was literally 100 feet behind her father and her stepsisters as they were looking for her and putting out this ad in the paper to hopefully find her. And this one photo that the photographer took captured all of them in the same frame. Lisa would, of course, read the article and get her father's contact information. She would reach out, and initially Michael actually thought it was a scam and didn't believe this was actually Lisa calling to say, "I found myself in the picture of you in Sudbury." But eventually he was convinced and he drove right out to Sudbury and he got a chance to meet his grandkids for the first time. And today, he and Lisa are...
Next story.
In this new story, quiet California urban legends that people still whisper about at night. In 2022, state records from a coastal county in California detailed a series of strange occurrences involving hikers. Local authorities reportedly investigated multiple claims of unidentified figures moving through the dense fog during the early morning hours near Big Sur. These archived notes suggest that several individuals vanished without a trace while walking along the well-marked trails of the region. Investigators never confirmed any foul play, yet some locals claim that certain sections of the forest should remain completely avoided. The official dispatch logs indicate that search parties found only abandoned equipment left behind by the missing people during late autumn. Mark was a 34-year-old park ranger who worked specifically within the rugged terrain of the Central Coast. His daily job required him to monitor wildlife patterns and maintain the safety of the various trails used by seasonal tourists. He arrived at the remote observation station with the goal of documenting local coyote populations for a state-funded study. Records conflict regarding his exact location during the final hours of his shift before he failed to check in officially. The county file from 2009 mentions that no distress signal was ever received from his standard-issue radio equipment. Mark reportedly left his official vehicle parked at the trailhead with the engine still running and the driver door open. The search team discovered a set of footprints that appeared to lead directly into a solid wall of thick brush. Archived notes from the investigation describe how the tracks stopped abruptly, as if the person had simply vanished into thin air. State records indicate that the soil around the tracks showed no signs of a struggle or any other human presence. Investigators never confirmed if the footprints belonged to Mark or if another person had been walking in that specific area. The county file from 2009 remains one of the most puzzling cases for the local sheriff department to solve. Some locals claimed that they heard a metallic tapping sound coming from the canyon for several nights after he disappeared. Sarah was a 28-year-old freelance photographer who traveled to the area to capture the unique natural light. She spent most of her time near the cliff edges where the Pacific Ocean meets the rocky shoreline of Northern California. Her purpose for being in the location was to complete a series of images for a prestigious travel magazine project. Sarah reportedly told her friends that she felt a strange sensation of being watched while she was taking her photographs. State records show that her last social media post was a photo of the ocean taken at 4 in the afternoon. The image appears to show a dark shape standing just behind a cluster of trees on the edge of the cliff. Dispatch logs reveal that several residents called the police to report a woman screaming near the beach that same evening. Investigators never confirmed the source of the screams, and they found no evidence of any person being in distress there. Archived notes describe how her car was found, with the keys still in the ignition and her wallet on the seat. Some locals claimed that the coastal fog can play tricks on the ears and make the wind sound like human voices. State records from 2023 indicate that a commercial diver found a small piece of blue fabric near the rocks. This fabric reportedly matched the color of the jacket Sarah was wearing on the day that she was last seen alive. The small-town residents often speak about a third individual named David, who was a 40-year-old local historian. David spent many years collecting old maps of the Sierra Nevada mountains to find the location of the lost village. The county file from 2009 includes a map that he had hand-drawn with several red circles on it. State records show that he purchased a large amount of survival gear just 2 days before he left for his trip. Some locals claimed that David believed the lost village was protected by people who did not want to be found. Investigators never confirmed if he reached his destination, but they found his empty tent near a remote mountain stream. Archived notes mention that the tent was torn from the inside as if something was trying to get out quickly. A local rancher reportedly told the sheriff that he saw a group of men dressed in dark clothing near the stream. Dispatch logs from 2015 indicate that the rancher was considered a reliable witness by the local authorities at the time. State records show that the men were never identified and they seem to have no connection to the nearby towns. Records conflict regarding whether the men were carrying tools or if they were simply walking through the dense forest area. Investigators never confirmed if these men were related to the disappearance of David or the other missing hikers in California. The county file from 2009 mentions that several other historians had disappeared in the same region over decades. Some locals claimed that there are secret tunnels under the mountains that date back to the time of the gold rush. State records indicate that no such tunnels have ever been officially discovered by geologists or by any modern survey teams. Archived notes from 2012 describe a series of low-frequency vibrations that were recorded by seismic sensors in the area. Investigators never confirmed the cause of these vibrations, but they noted that the local wildlife became very agitated and loud. Records conflict on whether these events are linked to the urban legends that continue to haunt the rural coastal towns. Another report in the dispatch logs from 2019 describes a driver who claimed to see a transparent figure on Highway 1. The driver was a 50-year-old long-haul trucker who had been working the California routes for 20 years. He reportedly saw a person standing in the middle of the road during a heavy rainstorm near the Big Sur Bridge. State records show that he slammed on his brakes, but there was no impact and no body was ever found. Investigators never confirmed if the trucker was suffering from fatigue or if he truly saw something on the lonely road. Archived notes from the Highway Patrol mention that 3 other drivers reported the same figure during that specific weekend. Some locals claimed that the figure is a woman who vanished from a nearby resort during the summer of 1990. Records conflict regarding her name, but the county file from 2009 contains a missing person report from that era. State records indicate that she was a 42-year-old tourist from Oregon who was visiting the coast alone. Dispatch logs from 1990 show that her hotel room was left exactly as if she intended to return shortly. Investigators never confirmed any leads in her case, and the file was eventually moved to the cold case department for review. The archive notes mention that her footprints were found leading away from the resort and into the deep ocean water. In 2021, a group of researchers found a set of old keys buried in the sand near the cliffs. The county file from 2009 lists these keys as a possible match for a car owned by David. State records show that the keys were heavily corroded, but they still functioned when they were tested on a similar lock. Some locals claimed that finding the keys was a sign that the missing people are still present in the area. Investigators never confirmed this theory, and the keys were placed into an evidence locker for further study by forensic teams. Archived notes from the lab report indicate that there was no usable DNA found on the surface of the metal. Dispatch logs from the winter of 2024 mention a series of strange phone calls to the local police station. The callers reportedly heard nothing but heavy breathing and the sound of waves crashing against the rocks on the line. State records show that these calls were traced back to a phone booth that had been disconnected for 15 years. Investigators never confirmed how a disconnected phone could make outgoing calls to the emergency dispatch center during the middle of the night. Records conflict on whether this was a technical glitch in the aging phone system or a series of deliberate pranks. Some locals claimed that the calls always happen on the anniversary of the major disappearances in the coastal region. Archive notes from a retired sheriff detail his personal belief that the geography of California hides many secrets from the public. He reportedly spent his retirement years cataloging the various urban legends and mapping them against the official state records of incidents. The county file from 2009 contains a letter he wrote to the governor regarding the high number of cases. State records show that the governor never responded to the letter, and the sheriff passed away in 2021. Investigators never confirmed if his research had any merit or if he was simply an old man with too much time. Some locals claimed that his private journals were taken by men in dark suits after his funeral ended. Records conflict regarding the contents of those journals, but some believe they contained the truth about the missing people of California. Archive notes from a local librarian suggest that the sheriff had found a pattern in the dates of the disappearances. State records show that most of the events occur during the transition between the spring and the summer seasons each year. Dispatch logs from 2025 indicate that 2 more hikers have gone missing near the same coastal trail system. Investigators never confirmed if these new cases are related to the historical legends that have been told for many years. Some locals claimed that the forest is slowly expanding and reclaiming the land that was once occupied by the settlers. The county file from 2009 remains a primary source of information for those who seek to understand these events. State records will continue to document the facts, while the urban legends will continue to grow in the quiet coastal towns. Archive notes from the investigation suggest that the truth may never be fully known by the authorities or the public. Investigators never confirmed any supernatural activity, but the data they collected remains difficult to explain using only modern scientific methods. Records conflict on the final count of people who have vanished into the fog of the Northern California coastline. Some locals claimed that if you listen closely.
Next story.
Got a job working construction on the Hudson River Railroad in New York. At this time in America, railroads were being laid all over the country, and so lots of workers like Phineas were needed to blast rock out of the way to lay down these railroad tracks. And as it happened, Phineas was an expert in explosives. He had learned how to set controlled blasts growing up on his family's farm in New Hampshire, and then later in his life, he had worked in a mine blasting through rock. And so in addition to just being the ideal railroad worker for this time in America, when Phineas actually started working in New York on this railroad, his coworkers immediately started looking up to him. Phineas was extremely smart and energetic. He was this incredible conversationalist. He was charismatic and funny and a natural leader. And so just 2 months into starting this new job, it was no surprise to anyone who knew Phineas or worked with Phineas that he was promoted to blasting foreman, which meant Phineas would lead the explosives team. Phineas was so excited about this promotion that he went to a blacksmith and had a custom tamping iron made. A tamping iron is a long metal rod that's used to pack explosives. When railroad workers wanted to blast through, let's say, a big rock, they would start by drilling a deep but skinny hole in the rock. Then they would pour blasting powder inside, then they'd put a fuse inside, and then using this tamping iron, they would push the blasting powder and the fuse deep into this hole inside of this rock or whatever it was they were blowing up. And then once it was packed, they would ignite it. Usually, tamping irons were sort of rough tools that looked like crowbars, but Phineas really wanted something special to commemorate this promotion. And so Phineas had the blacksmith make this perfectly straight, smooth, 4-foot-long metal tamping iron, and on one end was a pointed side, and on the other was a blunted side. And this rod, it weighed about 13 pounds, and it was about 1.25 inches in diameter. And Phineas loved this tamping iron. He brought it with him not just to work, but basically anywhere he went. On September 3rd, 1848, so not long after Phineas's big promotion, Phineas and his explosives team were blasting through some rock that ran through a forest. And Phineas, he was right up front over the blasting site, helping them prep the explosive. His team had drilled that long, deep, skinny hole into the rock they were about to blow up, and then blasting powder was put inside, a fuse was put inside, and then Phineas took his tamping iron and began packing the powder and fuse deep into the rock. And the way he did this is he used the blunt end of his tamping iron to pack the explosives, which meant the pointed end was sticking out of the rock. And so as Phineas is doing this, someone behind him slipped on a rock. One of his men tripped or something, and so Phineas, with his hands kind of on his tamping iron, turned to the right to look and see what was going on. And when he did this, somehow his tamping iron that was inside of this skinny hole must have nudged against the inside of the rock, created a spark, and ignited the explosive inside of the rock. Which meant the tamping iron was basically fired like a missile out of this hole into Phineas's head. It went in his cheek, up behind his left eye, up and out of his skull, and then shot 80 feet away, landing on the ground covered in Phineas's blood and brains. This happened so quickly that for a second after this thing has blown through Phineas's head, Phineas just stood there upright with his eyes wide, and then suddenly a geyser of blood began shooting out of the top of his head, and then Phineas fell backwards onto the ground. When Phineas's body hit the ground, he began having a seizure, at which point his coworkers, who were still kind of shaken up from this sudden blast, they rushed over and tried to kind of position him in a way that he wouldn't hurt himself. But I mean, they're looking at him and he's literally missing half of his head. He's covered in blood. And they're thinking, there's nothing we can do for him, but basically wait for him to die. And so all of Phineas's coworkers, who adored Phineas, just stood there very somber watching their boss die. But eventually, Phineas stopped having a seizure, and then he opened his eyes and he looked up at his crew, and he sat up and he said, "What happened?" Now remember, half of his head has been blown out by a 13-pound, 4-foot-long metal rod that has shot through his head. And his coworkers, when they heard how clearly he was speaking and how focused his eyes were, they couldn't believe it. How in the world is this guy alive, let alone having a coherent conversation with them? And so the coworkers told Phineas, "Please lie down, we'll get you help, lie down, relax." But Phineas, who still had blood also shooting out of his head, just kind of stood up casually and walked over to the railroad cart and signaled for his crew to take him back into town. And so the crew, they're looking over at Phineas, who now is literally head to toe just red from blood. Still bleeding, but less so, and he's just sitting on the railroad cart waiting for them. And so they walk over to him and they start the slow 1-mile journey into town on this railroad cart. And the whole time they're all kind of looking at Phineas, expecting him to die any second. But instead, Phineas is just kind of looking around with half of his head. And at some point he pulled out his logbook and carefully wrote down what time they were leaving their work site to make sure his crew was accurately paid. And then finally they reached town and Phineas was still very much alive and looking around, acting like nothing had happened to him. And the coworkers helped him to his hotel, and Phineas just sat outside on a chair in front of his hotel, just people watching, while his crew went and got a doctor. A doctor soon arrived, and he too was completely shocked at Phineas's appearance, but even more so was Phineas's eyes. He looked at the doctor, and his eyes were totally focused, like he was all there, totally lucid, looking at the doctor, waiting for him to come over and help him out with his little injury. And when the doctor kind of timidly approached Phineas, Phineas very famously said as he sat on his chair, "Doctor, here's business enough for you." Like everyone else, the doctor fully assumed that despite Phineas's miraculous recovery from this injury, that he would soon die from this horrific wound in his head. And so the doctor moved Phineas up into the hotel, put him in a bed, and then basically made him comfortable. Now, the doctor at this point was not trying to save Phineas. He felt like there was nothing he could do to save Phineas. At this point, it was like mercy. Let's make this as pain-free as possible for Phineas as he inevitably dies from this injury. But Phineas didn't die. He would break out of it and basically be okay again. However, his personality at first, after he came out of this state of delirium, was not really the same. No longer was he this funny, smart, charming, confident leader. Instead, he was this guy who seemed to have lost all of his inhibitions and was kind of childlike. He swore all the time. He would tell people he had these crazy plans he was going to go do, but he would never follow through with them. And he would tell his nieces and nephews these wild stories about himself that were obviously made up and not even close to reality. But overall, he was okay, even though you could see his brain pulsing underneath his skin on the side of his head that had been blown off. And within a couple of years of this injury, those changes to Phineas's personality kind of faded, and he really did become old Phineas. However, there was one unique quirk to Phineas post-injury that never went away. And that was Phineas's kind of unhealthy love for the tamping iron that had blown through his head. After his injury, Phineas kind of stopped making friends, and any friends he did have, he really didn't try to keep those relationships up. He didn't get married, he didn't have kids. Instead, the tamping iron became sort of like his best friend. He took it everywhere with him, even posing at one point with the tamping iron the way you would expect a couple to pose for a photo. 12 years after his horrific injury, Phineas would develop seizures, likely from the injury, and then he would die with his beloved tamping rod right by his side. His case changed neuroscience forever by showing that an injury to the brain could affect specific personality traits. Today, Phineas's skull and his tamping rod are on display.
Next story.
True creepy and scary horror stories from the Appalachian Mountains. In the autumn of 2021, a 24-year-old hiker named Elias Thorne, who worked as a land surveyor, entered the dense timber of the Monongahela National Forest for a weekend trek. He intended to document seasonal soil erosion patterns along the high ridges near the West Virginia border while testing new GPS equipment in deep terrain. Local dispatch logs from that evening indicate that the weather turned abruptly and a thick fog settled over the limestone valleys without any prior warning. Elias was a seasoned outdoorsman who understood the risks of the Appalachian landscape, but he reportedly failed to check in with his emergency contact. Investigators never confirmed if he strayed from the marked path or if the shifting weather conditions simply obscured the familiar landmarks of the trail. According to archive notes from the regional search team, Elias began to experience a series of equipment failures as he reached the higher elevations. The GPS unit displayed conflicting coordinates that suggested he was moving south, while his compass indicated a steady northern heading toward the primary base camp. He eventually decided to set up a temporary shelter near a rocky outcropping because the visibility had dropped to less than 10 feet. State records indicate that several other hikers in the vicinity reported hearing repetitive metallic sounds echoing through the trees during the late hours of the night. Some locals claimed that the sounds were merely the result of wind moving through abandoned mining shafts, but the county file from 2009 suggests otherwise. Elias woke up during the early morning hours to find that his heavy hiking boots had been moved precisely 3 feet away from his tent. There were no footprints in the soft mud surrounding his campsite, and the internal zipper of his tent was still locked from the previous night. He gathered his belongings in total silence while observing that the surrounding forest had become unnaturally quiet, as if the local wildlife had fled. Records conflict regarding the exact path he took to exit the forest, but Elias later stated that he felt a constant presence just behind him. The investigation concluded without finding any evidence of another person in the area, and the case remains a point of ambiguity for the local authorities. The state records from 2022 mention a second individual named Sarah Miller, who was a 32-year-old biologist studying local bat populations. Sarah was stationed in a remote cabin near the Clench Mountain Range, where she spent several weeks collecting data on nocturnal migratory patterns. Her logs mention that she discovered several strange markings carved into the trees surrounding her research site during the first week of her stay. She reportedly captured several audio recordings of a voice that seemed to mimic her own vocal patterns from the previous evening. Investigators never confirmed the source of the audio, but the archive notes suggest that Sarah became increasingly paranoid about her immediate surroundings. County files from 2015 describe an incident involving a park ranger named Marcus Reed, who was 45 years old at the time. Marcus was tasked with patrolling the northern boundaries of the Great Smoky Mountains, where several campers had reported seeing flickering lights in the distance. He arrived at a clearing near a decommissioned fire tower and discovered a collection of personal items neatly arranged in a circular pattern. The items included a digital watch and a pair of spectacles that appeared to belong to a missing person from 2012. Dispatch logs indicate that Marcus requested immediate backup after hearing a heavy breathing sound coming from the darkness just beyond his flashlight beam. Some locals claimed that the fire tower was the site of a forgotten settlement, but official state records show no evidence of any historical structures. Marcus reported that he saw a tall figure standing perfectly still near the base of the tower, but the figure vanished when he approached. The county file from 2009 mentions a similar encounter involving a group of hunters who were tracking deer in the same region. These men reportedly abandoned their equipment and fled the area after witnessing a series of blue flashes emanating from the forest floor. Investigators never confirmed the cause of the flashes, and the terrain was later declared off-limits for several months following the incident. A third individual, named James Bennett, was a 50-year-old retired police officer who enjoyed solo camping trips in the Blue Ridge Mountains. In the spring of 2016, he planned a 5-day excursion through a section of the forest known for its treacherous slopes. James was equipped with a high-frequency radio and a detailed map of the region that he had used for over 20 years. Archive notes indicate that he sent a brief transmission on the second night, stating that he had found an unmarked cave entrance. The transmission ended abruptly with a sharp static noise that the dispatch center was unable to filter or identify using standard equipment. Search teams arrived at the coordinates of the cave entrance only to find that the opening had been blocked by a massive rockfall. They discovered James's radio sitting on top of a flat stone, but there was no sign of a struggle or any physical tracks. Records conflict about whether the rockfall was a natural occurrence or if it had been triggered by an external force during the night. Some locals claimed to hear a muffled tapping sound coming from behind the rocks, but the sound was never captured on official recording devices. The state records from 2017 officially closed the case as a tragic accident involving an unforeseen geological event in a remote area. Investigators later discovered a series of photographs on James's camera that depicted a dark corridor lined with what appeared to be rusted metal doors. The photographs were blurry, and the light source was insufficient to provide a clear view of what lay beyond the threshold of the cave. Dispatch logs from that period show that several unauthorized individuals attempted to access the site before it was permanently sealed by the county. The county file from 2009 mentions a local legend about a hidden facility, but no evidence of such a place exists. James remains missing, and the true nature of the unmarked cave entrance continues to be a subject of intense local debate. In the winter of 2018, a 29-year-old geographer named Thomas Vance traveled to the rural outskirts of Kentucky. Thomas was employed by a private environmental firm to map the underground water tables and limestone aquifers hidden beneath the rugged hills. He reportedly established a base camp in a valley that local residents often avoided due to the frequent presence of heavy ground mist. State records from that month indicate that Thomas made several calls to his supervisor regarding anomalous readings on his seismic detection tools. The readings suggested that a large hollow space existed directly beneath his tent, but no known maps indicated any subterranean tunnels. According to dispatch logs, Thomas reported that the ground beneath his feet felt like it was vibrating rhythmically every night at 3 a.m. He decided to document the phenomenon using a high-sensitivity microphone and a series of motion sensors placed around the valley floor. Archived notes show that Thomas recorded a sound that resembled a low-frequency hum that caused structural damage to his electronic gear. Investigators never confirmed the source of the vibration, but the county file from 2009 mentions similar reports from local farmers. Thomas was found 3 days later wandering along a remote logging road in a state of deep confusion and physical exhaustion. He reportedly claimed that he had seen a series of vertical shafts hidden beneath the thick brush that were lined with smooth glass. The state records indicate that Thomas had lost all memory of how he had escaped the valley or where his equipment went. Search crews returned to the campsite, but they discovered that the entire area had been swept clean of any human presence. Even the flattened grass where his tent had stood was now standing upright as if no weight had ever been applied. Records conflict on whether Thomas suffered from a medical episode or if he had encountered.
Next story.
Something watched our campsite all night in the Appalachian Mountains. The Appalachian Mountains hold a history of strange disappearances that the local park rangers rarely discuss with the general public. Griffin Holloway worked as a professional wildlife photographer who specialized in documenting rare bird species in the remote mountain wilderness. He was 34 years old, and he had spent the last decade traveling through the most isolated mountain ranges. In October of 1998, he decided to travel to a remote section of the Blue Ridge Mountains area. His goal for the trip was to photograph the rare northern goshawk during its peak migration through the hardwood forest. He arrived at the trailhead during a particularly cold afternoon when the wind was beginning to howl through the trees. Griffin packed his professional equipment, including a heavy tripod and a specialized long lens for his high-end film camera. He hiked 4 miles into the backcountry before he decided to set up a small camp near a stream. The area was quiet, and the nearest paved road was a full day of hiking away from his current location. He built a small fire and he cooked a simple meal before the sun began to set behind the peaks. As the light faded, he felt a sudden and very distinct sensation that someone was standing just beyond the forest. He turned his flashlight toward the shadows, but he saw only the twisted branches and the thick blankets of moss. Griffin shrugged off the feeling and he climbed into his sleeping bag to get some rest for the early morning. He woke up at 3 a.m. to the sound of something heavy moving slowly around the outer perimeter. The movement was calculated and deliberate, as if the intruder was trying to avoid making any unnecessary noise on the protection. Griffin reached for his flashlight and he sat perfectly still while his heart hammered against his ribs in the dark. He heard a low and gravelly sound that resembled a person trying to clear their throat from a great distance. The photographer slowly unzipped the tent flap and he peered out into the misty clearing where the fire had died. He saw a pair of pale eyes reflecting the moonlight from behind a large oak tree about 20 feet away. The eyes remained perfectly stationary, and they did not blink even when he shone his bright flashlight directly at them. Griffin felt a surge of adrenaline, and he shouted a warning into the darkness to see if anyone would respond. There was no reply from the woods, and the eyes eventually vanished into the thick undergrowth without making a sound. He did not sleep for the rest of the night, and he kept his knife close to his hand until, when the sun finally rose, he began to inspect the area around his tent for any signs of the visitor. He found a set of tracks that looked like bare human feet, but the toes were unusually long and thin. Griffin decided to conduct a formal investigation by setting up a series of motion-activated cameras around the campsite area. He spent the entire afternoon carefully hiding the lenses behind piles of brush and inside the hollow trunks of trees. He used a specialized high-speed film that was designed to capture clear images in very low light conditions indeed. While he was working, he found a discarded leather glove that did not belong to him near the creek bed. The glove was extremely old, and the leather had been stitched together with a material that looked like dried vine. He placed the glove in a plastic bag, and he made a note of the exact location in his journal. That evening, he did not light a fire because he wanted to remain as inconspicuous as possible in the. He sat in his tent with a pair of night vision goggles, and he watched the tree line for movement. At midnight, he saw a group of 3 tall figures emerge from the shadows near the edge of the. They did not move like humans, but they walked with a rhythmic and swaying motion that was very unsettling too. One of the figures approached the spot where he had placed the motion-activated camera, and it stood perfectly still. It reached out a hand that had unusually long fingers, and it gently touched the lens of the expensive camera. The figure was at least 7 feet tall, and it was covered in a layer of matted and gray hair. Griffin realized that these beings were not interested in his food or his supplies, but were curious about his tools. They began to mimic the way he had moved earlier in the day by walking in a slow and deliberate. One of the figures picked up a small rock, and it held the stone to its eye like a camera. Griffin felt a deep sense of dread as he watched the creatures study his behavior with a high level. He realized that they had been watching him since he first entered the woods 3 days ago on the trail. The photographer remained in his tent, and he prayed that the creatures would not decide to enter his small shelter. After an hour of observation, the figures retreated back into the woods, and the forest became eerily silent once again. Griffin waited until the first light of dawn before he gathered his gear and began the long hike back. He moved as quickly as he could, but he constantly looked over his shoulder to see if he was followed. He reached the ranger station in the late afternoon, and he asked to speak with the senior officer on duty. The ranger was a man named Silas Thorne, who had worked in the Appalachian Mountains for over 30 years total. Griffin described the figures and the way they had mimicked his movements during the long night at the remote camp. Silas listened to the story with a grim expression, and he did not seem surprised by the details of the ranger explained that there were several reports of these beings dating back to the late 1800s in the Rosette. He referred to them as the observers, and he said they were a group of feral people who lived. According to the archives, the observers did not attack hikers, but they were known for stealing items to use for. Silas showed Griffin a collection of items that had been recovered from abandoned camps over the last few decades of. The collection included rusted cameras and broken binoculars that had been carefully wrapped in animal skins and tied with vines. The ranger warned Griffin that the observers were becoming more bold and were starting to follow people closer to town. Griffin realized that the glove he found was likely a piece of clothing that the beings had tried to. The photographer returned to his home, but he could not stop thinking about the pale eyes in the dark forest. He processed the film from his motion-activated cameras, and he found several clear shots of the tall gray figures. The images showed the beings standing in a circle and looking directly into the camera lens with a curious expression. One of the figures was wearing the leather glove he had found near the creek bed earlier in the day. Griffin decided to share his findings with a local university professor who specialized in Appalachian history and human behavior. The professor examined the photos, and he suggested that the observers were a remnant of an ancient and isolated community. He believed that they had lost the ability to speak, but had developed a highly advanced system of visual mimicry. The university launched a small expedition to the area, but they found no trace of the observers or the. It seemed as though the beings knew they were being hunted, and they had moved deeper into the mountain range. Griffin never returned to that section of the woods, but he still keeps the photos in a locked desk. He sometimes hears a rhythmic tapping on his window at night, and he wonders if they have finally found. The Appalachian Mountains are a place where the past and the present often collide in ways that we cannot understand. Griffin Holloway eventually retired from wildlife photography, and he moved to a quiet town far away from the dark woods. He often tells his story to other hikers as a warning to always be aware of their surroundings. He knows that there are things in the mountains that do not want to be mapped or understood by. The legend of the observers continues to grow, and more people report seeing the pale eyes in the forest. Some people say that the beings are guardians of the wilderness, while others believe they are something much more. The ranger station still keeps a file on the disappearances, but the official cause is always listed as accidental. Griffin believes that the observers are still out there, and they are still watching the people who enter the D. He remembers the way the figure held the rock to its eye, and he knows they are still learning. The mountains hold their secrets tightly, and they do not give them up to anyone who is not invited. Every October, he looks at the mountains, and he remembers the night he was studied by the Silent Watchers. The investigation into the leather glove revealed that the stitching was made from a rare type of mountain orchid root. This plant only grows in the highest and most inaccessible parts of the mountain range near the rocky peaks. This discovery suggested that the observers had a deep knowledge of the local flora and how to use it. Griffin realized that the beings were far more intelligent than he had initially believed when he first saw them. He spent his final years writing a book about the experience, but he never published the final and most. He died in 2024, and he left his collection of photos to the local historical society in town. The researchers who studied the images found that the observers were often visible in the background of his earlier. It appeared that they had been following him for years before he ever noticed their presence in the dark. This realization changed the way the community viewed the forest and the people who lived in the mountain shadows. The mystery of the Appalachian observers remains unsolved, and the files are still open at the local sheriff office. The town of Blackwood remains a quiet place, but the residents always lock their doors when the sun goes down. They know that the mountains are not just rocks and trees, but are home to something that is still. Silas Thorne occasionally visits the old trailhead, and he leaves a small gift of fruit or cloth on the day. He says it is a way to keep the peace between the town and the beings who live above. Some people laugh at him, but others bring their own offerings to the edge of the dark and thick. The forest seems to accept these gifts, and the number of disappearances has decreased significantly over the last few. Griffin Holloway is buried in a small cemetery that overlooks the peaks he once loved to photograph so much. His headstone has a small carving of a camera and a single pair of eyes watching from the bottom. People who visit the grave often report feeling as though they are being observed from the trees near the prom. It is a fitting tribute to a man who spent his life looking at things that did not want. The Appalachian Mountains continue to stand tall, and they keep their secrets hidden beneath the canopy of the green. The final recording Griffin made before he left the mountains was a simple description of the silence in the coding. He said that the woods were not truly quiet, but were filled with the sound of 1,000 heartbeats. He believed that the mountain was one large organism, and the observers were its eyes and its long ears. This theory was never proven, but it remains a popular topic among the local hunters and the forest rangers. The film from the motion-activated cameras is now stored in a climate-controlled vault to preserve the images. Many people have tried to find the clearing where Griffin camped, but the trails have changed over the years. It seems as though the mountain has moved the path to protect the beings who live in the shadows. Silas Thorne says that some things are not meant to be found by those who do not belong there. He still patrols the lower trails, but he never goes above the ridgeline after the sun has set. He knows that the observers are still there, and they are still waiting for the next person to. The story of the Appalachian Watchers is a reminder that we are never truly alone when we are outside. In this new story, the Cumberland.
Next story.
Were never made public. In the late 1860s, a group of rugged American explorers came out of the wilderness and went straight to a newspaper to tell them about this otherworldly place they had found. And so the newspaper sat down, they got their notepad out, and these explorers start describing this place. And they say, okay, well, it's this huge expanse of wilderness. And in the middle of it, there are all these boiling lakes that are either neon green or yellow or red or all of those. And they're shooting boiling water into the sky. And there are these breathtaking waterfalls and snow-capped mountains, and there are bison and elk and wolves and bears just free roaming the whole area. And so the newspaper, they take all this down, and at the end of it, they say, okay, guys, well, unfortunately, we don't publish fiction. But these explorers weren't lying. They were describing an area that we now know as Yellowstone National Park, which is this massive expanse of wilderness in Wyoming that sits on top of a volcano. And those boiling neon green, red, and yellow lakes really do exist. Those are hot springs, and they are the result of water passing by and making contact with underground magma chambers. Today, Yellowstone is so popular that every year millions of people go to the park, and so as a result, the park employs hundreds of people year-round to keep up with tourism. Many of these employees are young people, like college students, and in addition to being paid for their work, the park also offers them the ability to live in employee housing, which are basically dormitories dormitories spaced all across the park to make it easier to just be on site and do their job. And these dormitories are either free or very low cost. And so these young people typically take up that offer and will stay inside of these dormitories for as long as they're working at the park. And so in 2000, a 20-year-old summer employee named Sarah Hulfers, she was staying in one of these dormitories in the park, and she was in her room when a group of other young employees that were staying in this dorm came down the hall, and they knocked on her door and they asked her if she wanted to come with them to go swimming. And so Sarah, she had a day off and she wasn't doing anything, and so she said, sure, I'll come with you guys. And so after they all got their bathing suits on and got their towels and snacks packed, they left the dormitories and got into a couple of cars, and then they drove over to this dirt lot that was right up against this huge forest. And so they parked, they got out, and they make their way over to this trailhead that begins in the parking lot and goes straight into this forest. And so they walk down this trail until the trail goes right out of the forest and brings them to the edge of this river. And this river was called the Firehole River. It was called that because the surface of this river steamed, and it gave the impression that this river was on fire. The reason this happened is some of the water flowing through this river would pass by those underground magma chambers, warming it up. And so this is a lot like the hot springs, except on a much smaller level. The hot springs are boiling, whereas this river was just slightly warmer to the point where it would steam. So totally safe to swim in. So Sarah and the rest of this group, they come out of that trailhead and they're standing on the edge of this beautiful river, and they walk down to the edge and they all jump in and they have this great day. They're swimming around, they're playing games, and they were only expecting to be there for a couple of hours, but they were having so much fun that before long, the sun had gone down and they were still in the river. And so when it was dark out, they finally climbed out of the river and they toweled off, and then they realized they had a bit of a problem. Because they did not expect to be there for as long as they were, no one had brought flashlights, and the way back to the parking lot would be going along that trail through the forest, but that was a pretty far trail, and it's totally pitch black out. There's no ambient light. And realistically, there's some pretty big animals that live inside of that forest. And so some people in this group were a little bit nervous about walking through this forest. But ultimately, about half of the group said, you know what, whatever, let's just run through the forest and get back to our cars as fast as we can. I'm sure nothing will happen to us. And the other half decided they would look for an alternative route that would skirt the forest and allow the moonlight to be their guide along the way. That second group was made up of Sarah, along with two 18-year-old boys named Lance Bucci and Tyler Montague. So Sarah and these two boys, they're standing there and they're watching the first group go into the forest and disappear. And then she, along with these two guys, they turn right and they begin skirting the river and walking around the forest. And so they walk downstream with the river on one side and the forest on their left, and they're walking for a while until they see up ahead on their left, it looks like the forest is starting to thin out maybe a little bit. And so they took that as an opportunity to cut left and basically begin kind of going straight towards the parking lot, which was generally off to their left. And so they make that turn, they start walking, and the terrain is relatively open. It's this big open field with a couple of trees here and there. It was pretty easy to navigate, and they felt like, hey, we found a great alternative route. The moonlight's still shining through. We got great visibility. And so they're walking along happy as can be. And then they see there's a couple of streams up ahead. They get to the first stream and it's not that big, so they jump across it. They get to the next stream. It's still not that big. They jump across that one. And then they get to this third stream and they realize, you know, it's still pretty small, but it's significantly bigger than the last two. And so if we mistime it, we could fall into it. Now, this was not some huge deal. They were already wet from having gone swimming, but they didn't want to jump in this stream. And so they considered walking off to the right and trying to find an area that was more narrow they could jump across more easily. But they figured they were probably within maybe 100 or 200 feet of the parking lot. They couldn't see it, but they knew they were close. And they really didn't want to go farther and farther away to only have to just jump over this thing anyways. And so they decide, you know what, let's just jump across it. Let's just do it. If we fall in, we fall in. And so the three of them backed up from the stream to give themselves some running room. And then they grabbed hands. And at the same time, all three of them ran forward and leapt across the stream. And they cleared it. They landed on the other side, but the ground they landed on was kind of loose and soft. And so it kind of crumbled underneath them and they all fell backwards into the stream. stream. In the darkness, this stream had looked like the other two streams they had seen, albeit a little bit larger, and so they were not thinking this could be potentially hazardous if they fell into the water. But it would turn out this stream was extremely hazardous. It was nothing like the other two streams they had encountered. This one was runoff from a nearby hot spring, and so the temperature inside of this stream was 178 degrees Fahrenheit. So it was practically boiling water, and it looked like it was shallow, but in fact, this stream was 10 feet deep. And so when this trio fell into these scalding waters, they let out blood-curdling screams, and the other group that had ran down the forest path, they had got to the parking lot and were waiting for them, and so they hear this scream, and they just take off running in the direction of the screams. They cut right through the forest, and they come out to that field, and they find Lance and Tyler are on the edge of the stream, desperately trying to pull Sarah out of the water. And so the parking lot crew, they run over, and they grab Sarah, they pull her out. They don't really know what's happened. They don't know this is some boiling stream, but it very quickly dawns on them when Lance and Tyler and Sarah just continue to scream outside of the water that something is horribly wrong. And so one of the people in the parking lot crew, they take off running, they go into one of their cars, and they drive and they get help. And not that long after, a helicopter would arrive, and it would take Sarah, Lance, and Tyler to a nearby hospital. It would turn out Lance and Tyler, when they fell into this water, they only submerged up to their necks, and as soon as they hit the water, they immediately turned and got themselves out again. So they were only in the water for maybe a second or two. And these things ultimately saved their lives, although they did still have burns over almost their entire bodies. They had to go through dozens and dozens of surgeries and years of rehab, and they had to pay all this money for medical bills. So it was not a smooth course after they got pulled out, but they lived. As for Sarah, she was not as lucky. When she fell into the water, she completely submerged. Her head, her body, all of it went under the water, and then she just could not get herself out again. And so she stayed in the water much longer than the guys did. When she was admitted to the hospital, despite the fact she was talking and conscious, the doctors very quickly realized they had a big problem with her. A third-degree burn, or a full thickness burn, is when the outer layer of skin gets destroyed, and also the inner, deeper tissues of the skin also gets destroyed, including the cells that are responsible for reproducing skin. And so if you get a third-degree burn, that part of your body will not heal on its own. You literally have to get a skin graft. And a skin graft is effectively a skin transplant. They will take other sections of skin from your body that are unburned, and they will place them over that site where you have the third-degree burn. But when Sarah was wheeled into the operating room, it was determined that she had third-degree burns on 100% of her body. So there was no unburned skin to use for a skin graft. Her whole body was ruined. And so despite their best efforts, Sarah would pass away 15 hours after arriving at the hospital. A year later, Lance's family would sue the National Park Service for not having put up a sign near that particular stream to warn people of its dangers. But that lawsuit was tossed out because it was determined that the trio, Sarah, Tyler, and Lance, had chosen to walk off trail in a known thermal area. And
Next story.
an Italian man and his 6-year-old son walked to the edge of their property in Frascati, which is an area in Italy known as the hub of Rome's local wine industry. The father needed to repair a section of their fence, and his son, who he said had the soul of Huckleberry Finn, wanted to tag along. But as soon as the work began, Alfredo just wanted to go play in the vineyards, and so he ran off. And the father didn't think much of it because his son always played in the vineyards and just figured he would see him back at the house. When the father finished up the work around 7 p.m. and walked back into his house, he was surprised that Alfredo wasn't there. And so he asked his wife, have you seen our son? And she said, no, can you go out and find him because dinner's going to be on the table any minute. So the father goes back outside expecting to see Alfredo come running out from behind some hiding place, but he doesn't. And he yells out for his son and doesn't get a response. And so he begins walking his property and yelling for Alfredo, and he's not finding him. And so after 2 hours of looking, he finally just calls the police. The police arrive, and initially it's just a couple of officers with flashlights, and they spend about 2 hours looking as well. They can't find him, so they call in backup in the form of officers with sniffer dogs, and the dogs began searching the property for another 3 hours, and they still couldn't find him. A little after midnight, the fire department, known in Italy as the fire brigade, they joined in as well. Shortly thereafter, a fire brigade officer was on the edge of Alfredo's property when he discovered a small hole in the ground. It would turn out Alfredo's neighbor had dug an illegal well, which was a common practice at the time, and generally, if you dug one of these wells and you struck water, you would report the well. But if you dug down and you didn't find water, you would just cover it up with a girder and you wouldn't tell anyone. In this case, however, the hole the officer was looking at did not have anything covering it. And so he knelt down and he yelled Alfredo's name into this hole, and at first he didn't hear anything. Then he yelled again, and he heard Alfredo yell back for his mother. Alfredo must not have seen the opening as he was running around playing, and he fell feet first into an 80-meter deep shaft. After Alfredo was found, the fire brigade took over rescue efforts, and so additional fire brigade units were called to help. But as soon as those additional units showed up, the captains of the different units began arguing with each other because it wasn't really clear how they were going to get him out. And unfortunately, the fire brigade immediately made a very bad decision. They decided to lower a plank into the shaft attached by a rope that he could grab onto, and they could pull him out that way. But when they lowered it at about 24 meters, the plank got stuck inside of the tunnel. And when they yanked on the rope to try to free it, the rope came off of the plank, but the plank remained wedged in the tunnel, blocking the tunnel. By the following morning, TV crews had swarmed the area, and one of them offered up a two-way microphone that could be lowered down into the hole so they could talk directly to Alfredo. When the microphone was finally lowered down next to his face, he was crying and pleading for them to get him out and that he missed his mother. Amateur spelunker Tullio Barnaby, a 23-year-old, had come over and joined the vigil that night. The plank plan shocked him for its foolishness, and so too did the scene. It was like everyone and no one was in charge. The well opening had been widened in hopes that a very skinny person would be willing to be lowered down to remove the piece of wood that was obstructing the tunnel. And since Tullio was a spelunker and was comfortable in confined spaces and was pretty skinny, he volunteered himself to do it. As he was lowered down, he quickly realized the inside of this tunnel was not a straight shot. It was more like a corkscrew. And so because of its windy nature, he was not able to get down to the wood. And so he signaled to go back up again. And when he reached the surface, he didn't have the wood in hand, but he told the fire brigade that because of the windy nature, it's unlikely Alfredo fell all the way to the bottom. He's probably stuck somewhere in the middle, which is a good thing. But we have to be really careful as we pull him out that we don't do anything that unintentionally causes him to slip farther into the hole. Tullio's suggestion was they go out and recruit professional spelunkers to be involved in the rescue because they would understand how to get someone out of such a tight space so far down in the ground. But the fire brigade disregarded his advice and said, we don't have enough time for that. At 6 a.m. the next day, about 12 hours after Alfredo's fallen into the swell, the fire brigade would make another very poor decision. They decided they would drill down another hole parallel to the one Alfredo was in, and they would drill down past the point they believed Alfredo was, at which point they would turn and drill laterally and connect to the tunnel Alfredo's in, grabbing Alfredo, pulling him across, and back up the new tunnel. Tullio objected, and he said the vibrations from this drill are almost certainly going to dislodge the boy and cause him to slip farther into the tunnel. But once again, the fire brigade did not listen to him. The drilling began about 2 hours later, and by that afternoon, Alfredo's plight had become major national news, with every single TV station playing a 24/7 live broadcast of the well, watching the drilling take place. Even the Italian president made a special trip to the well to see how it was going. But the drilling was very slow, and Alfredo, he had that microphone next to his head, and he was crying half the time, and the other times he was just pleading with them to get him out and saying he was cold or that he was tired, and the rescuers would say, we're going to be down there to get you, don't fall asleep, we're going to get you out of there. Finally, after 36 hours, they had drilled all the way down to their intended stopping point, and they began drilling across into Alfredo's well. When they finally broke into Alfredo's well, rescuers rushed in with flashlights and looked up and looked down, and there was no sign of Alfredo. And they called it up to the top, and they said, he's not here. And then all of a sudden, they heard a faint voice coming from all the way down at the bottom of the well. The vibrations from all of the drilling had indeed caused Alfredo to slip all the way to the very bottom. They estimated he was approximately 30 meters below this new parallel tunnel, and at that depth, the temperatures would be freezing. And so now Alfredo, on top of everything else, was facing hypothermia. They quickly lowered the microphone again down to Alfredo, and they told him, we're going to get you out of there. We're sorry we dropped you, but we're going to get you. And Alfredo's voice came back weak. He was tired, he was sore, he was freezing, he was crying. It was like the situation was just getting so much worse by the second, and rescuers knew they had to get to him probably in the next couple of hours, or that was it. And so another skinny man volunteered to go down into the hole, and they lowered him, and he would go all the way down to the bottom where Alfredo was. And he would call up that he found him and that Alfredo was alive. But Alfredo was stuck waist deep in this mud that the guy could not pull him out of. And so every time he'd begin to raise him slightly out of the mud, he'd lose his grip and he would fall back into the mud, going deeper into the mud each time. And after the 7th time of not being able to do it, Alfredo was getting dangerously close to being neck deep in the mud. And so the guy had to be pulled back out again. As soon as he was pulled back out again, more men volunteered themselves to go in there and try to yank him out, but many of them were not able to even get down to Alfredo. They would get stuck along the way. A couple did get to Alfredo, but they said his condition was worsening, he was weak, he wasn't even assisting trying to get pulled out. It was clear they were reaching the end. Finally, at 6:36 a.m. on Saturday, so 2.5 days after Alfredo fell in, they could not get him to respond on that two-way microphone. And so they sent down a sonar probe and they could not detect a heartbeat, and doctors declared him dead. The next day, liquid nitrogen was poured into the hole to preserve the body, and then 31 days later, they were finally able to extract it. After it was all over, the 25 million plus people that watched this take place live on television were crushed with what happened to Alfredo. There was a general sense that lots of people let this poor child down, which led to his death. But the person who was ultimately held accountable for it was the neighbor, who had illegally dug the well. And so the neighbor was charged with manslaughter and
Next story.
On the afternoon of December 15th, 1997, a brand new mother named Luz Cuevas sat on her couch in her little apartment in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, cradling her beautiful 10-day-old baby girl who she had named Delamar Vera. And in the room with Luz and her daughter were some members of Luz's extended family who had come over to meet the baby. And so for about an hour, the family all took turns, holding the baby and complimenting how cute her little dimples looked. And then eventually the baby started to get fussy, at which point Luz said she was going to take her upstairs and put her to bed. And so Luz brought Delamar upstairs to her nursery, and she put the baby down in her crib, and she stayed with her for a bit until Delamar finally had kind of dozed off to sleep. And so after being sure that her daughter wasn't going to stir, Luz got up and she began making her way towards the door. And right before she left, she made sure to plug in the space heater for her daughter's room to make sure it would stay warm enough while her daughter slept. And then after that, she left the room, shut the nursery door, and went back downstairs to rejoin her family. Luz's family didn't stick around much longer after Luz came downstairs, and after they were all gone, Luz realized she was totally exhausted, and her daughter was still fast asleep upstairs, and so Luz decided she would also lie down and try to take a nap herself. But as soon as she closed her eyes, she heard this loud thud sound coming from the second floor, and it sounded like something really heavy had smashed into the ground, and she's thinking, her daughter's up there. Could that be her daughter somehow falling out of the crib or something? And so Luz jumped up, sprinted upstairs, and as she looked down the hall, she could clearly see there was black smoke billowing out of her daughter's nursery. And so Luz charges down the hall, she opens up the door, and she looks into her daughter's room, and it's completely engulfed in flames. I mean, everything is on fire, but it's her baby girl in there, and so without any hesitation, Luz charges into the inferno. But when she gets up to the crib, the crib is so completely on fire that when she looks in, she can't even see her daughter. And so in a craze, she begins looking around the room, thinking maybe my daughter did fall out of the crib and she's somewhere else in the room, but everything is on fire. She can't see anything. And so as Luz is literally catching on fire and breathing in all the smoke, she's screaming for her daughter. And then a couple of minutes later, firefighters burst into the door and they literally drag Luz out of the nursery. She hasn't found her daughter. She's screaming, where's my baby? But the firefighters, they bring her outside. And just a couple of minutes later, they were able to extinguish this blaze. And after they came out of the house again, they found Luz, who had all these terrible burns in her body, and she's totally messed up from this fire. And they tell her that, unfortunately, her daughter was dead. After Delamar's death, Luz's life completely fell apart. I mean, the grief was so immense. It was like she could no longer function in society. I mean, she actually retracted from the world, stopped interacting with people, didn't see her family. She wound up getting a divorce from her husband just over the grief and the sadness of losing this child. I mean, it was like her life basically ended when her daughter's life ended. But on top of that, Luz also felt this incredible sense of guilt because after the fire, the investigators told her that the cause of the fire, although not conclusive, was very likely from that space heater she had plugged in right before she had left the room. And so, of course, Luce is feeling this incredible burden for having potentially killed her daughter, but also she just began to obsess over the details because, again, it wasn't conclusive that it was the space heater. That was their best guess as to what caused the fire. And so Luce began to wonder, was it something else? Was it preventable? What was it? Basically, Luce became completely obsessed with what happened to her daughter. It was like the only thing she ever thought of for years. Fast forward to January 24th, 2004, so 6 years after the fire. And on this day, Luce was invited to a family party. There was a get-together, and, Luce basically never went to any family function or really left her house much at all. But for some reason, on this day, she decided to go out. And so she goes to this party, and when she gets there, remember, Luce has basically been a recluse for the past 6 years. And so she's not going to immediately start socializing. And so instead, she just goes in the house and kind of finds a spot in the back, kind of away from everybody else who's chatting, and just stands there, kind of people watching. And as she's doing that, something catches her attention off to the side. And when she turns to look at it and sees what it is, she immediately just freezes. 3 days later, Luce walked into the office of a local state legislator, and after saying hello, she sat down, reached into her purse, and pulled out a little plastic bag that contained a folded-up napkin. And she slid it across the table to the legislator. So he picked up the bag and stared at it inquisitively as Luce dove into this wild explanation about what was in this bag and why she was here. And at the end of this totally off-the-wall, insane-sounding story, the legislator was left just kind of staring at Luce and looking back at the bag in total shock. And then finally, after a couple of moments of silence, the legislator just said, "Okay, yeah, I'll see what I can do." It would turn out the fire was not caused by the space heater that Luce had plugged in right before she left her daughter's room. Instead, police believe after Luce came downstairs and tried to take a nap, somebody broke into her apartment, went into the nursery, and set the fire on purpose, but not before abducting the baby. And that person was one of Luce's own family members who had been at her apartment that day celebrating the birth of Delamar Vera. It was Luce's husband's cousin, Carolyn Correa. And in fact, on this same day, before the fire and before the abduction, Carolyn made a point to announce to the whole family that she was pregnant, even though she wasn't. It was just going to be her cover story for why she suddenly had this brand new baby. 6 years later, when Luce was at that family party, well, the thing that caught her attention on the other side of the room was her daughter. She literally saw her daughter, and even though she hadn't seen her in 6 years, she instantly knew it was her because of her distinctive dimples. Now, Luce knew she couldn't just suddenly yell out, "That's my daughter!" So instead, she came up with this plan. She walked up to the girl and very discreetly said, "Hey, honey, I think you got some gum in your hair." And so as she pretended to pull gum out of the child's hair, she carefully plucked a few strands and put them inside of a napkin and put it inside of her pocket. And then 3 days later, she brought that hair inside of that plastic baggie and she gave it to the legislator and basically said, "Here's what I think happened. I think she stole my kid. Can you test it for DNA to prove that girl is my daughter?" And the legislator was like, "Okay, I'll give it a shot." And lo and behold, that hair would prove that girl at the party was her daughter. She did not die in that fire. Carolyn Correa was sentenced to 9 to 30 years in prison for abduction. She originally had an arson charge against her as well, but investigators could not actually prove how the fire started, and so they ultimately dropped those charges. Officials also launched an inquiry into how the fire department had handled the original investigation, because Luce had tried to convince fire officials that, maybe her daughter had not died in the blaze, maybe she was just missing, because when Luce went into the nursery, she claimed she couldn't even find her daughter. But investigators had told her that the fire had burned so hot that basically her daughter had been totally incinerated, and that's why she couldn't find her. In the end, though, because of her refusal to ever give up, Luce was ultimately reunited with her daughter, Delamar. The next and final story of today's episode is called
Next story.
In 2003, 27-year-old Kurt Smith was employed as an engineer for the German shipping company called Hapag-Lloyd. Over the past year, he had completed 2 separate 4-month-long deployments with this company, and he enjoyed the work enough that he asked for a contract extension. It was granted, and on July 11th of that year, he boarded the CM London Express to begin his 3rd deployment. 3 months into it, one of the ship's pistons broke. The piston is the part of the engine that goes up and down inside the hollow cylinder of the engine block. They would need to turn off the engine in order to make this repair, and so they made an unplanned stop in Savannah, Georgia. Once they got there, Kurt, along with 7 people under his command, headed down to the engine room to begin the process. Over the next several hours, the men were able to extract the broken piston and put in the new one. But this was back-breaking work. It was so hot in the engine room. What they're moving around is so heavy and cumbersome, and they're all bickering with each other. And at some point, Kurt called out the foreman for being lazy, and the foreman did not like that, and he was very popular amongst this group. And so by the end of getting the piston back in, everybody in there just totally resented Kurt. But ultimately, they got it done, and Kurt cut everybody loose except for the foreman. He told him he needed to stay back and help him ensure all the pistons were properly installed. To do that, they would need to go inside of something called the scavenger air receiver, which is this tube that's 55 feet long by 5 feet wide with access hatches on either side, and it sits right next to the engine block. Each hatch on either end had 3 latches on the outside that were called dogs. And so Kurt undid the 3 dogs on his hatch, and he opened it up. He crawled inside of the tube with his flashlight, and he began crawling. And on his left side were these square cutouts, these windows called scavenger ports that looked into each of the engine cylinders. And so Kurt crawled along counting the different cylinders until he got to the 6th one, which is where they had replaced that piston. Meanwhile, the foreman went around to the aft hatch. He undid the 3 dogs, he opened up the hatch, and then using a remote controlled device, he was able to bring the pistons into position safely so Kurt could inspect them through the scavenger port. The procedure on the ship was if you were inspecting one cylinder, the expectation is you would inspect all of them. And that entire process took about an hour, and Kurt just didn't feel like doing it. He was tired, he had a bad day, he was hungry. And so after he was certain the new piston was working just fine, he kind of rushed his checks on the other cylinders, and after only about 20 minutes, he told the foreman that, yep, we're good, we can leave. So he and the foreman got out, they dogged their hatches, and they headed up to their rooms to change. Their captain had been told they had to leave port no later than 9:30 that night because a huge tanker was coming in and there'd be no space for them. But at 8 p.m., as everyone is running around prepping the ship, somebody noticed Kurt was not at his workstation. The chief engineer called down to the engine room to ask anyone down there if they had seen Kurt, but nobody had. So a sailor was sent down to Kurt's cabin to see if he was in there, but he wasn't. At this point, because they only had about an hour until they were departing, they had to find Kurt. So they sounded the alarm on their ship, which was a little bit premature, but they figured, let's get everybody involved and just find Kurt. And so everybody stopped what they were doing and began searching the ship. During the search, a sailor was down near the scavenger air recovery space, and he noticed on the forward hatch there was a little piece of rag poking out of the top right corner of the forward hatch, and the lower 2 dogs were not set. He knew they were having issues getting a good seal on this particular hatch because there was a divot in one of the O-rings. And so he figured someone must have put a rag right over that divot to try to help seal this hatch, and they just forgot to shut the 2 lower dogs. Now, it did cross this sailor's mind that Kurt could have gotten inside of the scavenger air recovery space and then somehow got locked inside, and so he did want to investigate. However, there was a very strict policy about who was allowed to actually open up the scavenger air recovery hatches. And it wasn't this sailor. It was only the foreman, the chief engineer, and Kurt. And so this sailor decided to play it safe and just close the lower 2 dogs, and then told his superior that there was this weird rag poking out of the forward hatch and that someone should go down there and open it up and see if Kurt's inside. And so his superior went and told the chief engineer. And so as the chief engineer is making his way down to check on this strange rag situation, the foreman, completely independently, had gone around to the back of the scavenger unit to the aft hatch, so not the one with the rag poking out of it, and he unlocked the 3 dogs, he opened the hatch, he looked inside and shined his light, didn't see anyone, shut the hatch, locked all 3 dogs, and then began to walk away right as the chief engineer came down and saw him. And he saw him securing the scavenger air unit, and he said, hey, I was just coming down here to check to make sure Kurt wasn't in there, and you just checked, right? He's not in there? And the foreman said, yeah, no one's in there, it's all good. And so the two of them, the foreman and the chief engineer, did not check on the rag. They just left. The search for Kurt continued on the ship, but they could not find him. And so as 9:30 was approaching, the captain called the port authority and he said, "Hey, we're down someone. Can you please send someone out to look around?" And so a search on the land began, but they couldn't find Kurt. And so finally 9:30 came around and the big container ship that was supposed to come in and take their place was just waiting right out in the water for them to leave. And so the captain did his best to linger for another 10-15 minutes, but finally they were forced to leave even though they had no idea where Kurt was. So they fired up the engine and they left. The general consensus on the ship was that Kurt must have fallen overboard and drowned. Or maybe he ran ashore and ran off, but that was very unlike him. And so an investigation was launched, but it would probably be a while before anybody found out what happened to him. Finally, 2 days later, they arrived in port at Norfolk, Virginia. They powered off the engine and they got the ship ready to be put into harbor mode, where basically they open up all the hatches and they prep it to sit there for a while. And during that process, the foreman went down to the scavenger air recovery space and he opened up the forward hatch and he found Kurt. Although no one has all the details of what happened to Kurt, the leading theory is 2 days earlier when he had done that abbreviated check of the engine cylinders, when he had basically cut it short with the foreman because he just didn't want to do it, he had gotten back up to his room and started to think to himself that if anything goes wrong with any of those pistons, that I'm going to be to blame because the foreman was with me and I called the foreman lazy earlier and he doesn't like me, and so he's bound to turn me in. So Kurt decided he would go back down and do a more thorough check. But he didn't want anybody to know he was second guessing himself, and so he was going to do this alone, even though it was a huge no-no to go inside of the scavenger air unit by yourself. Because if you manage to get stuck in there by yourself, horrible things are going to happen to you, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. But Kurt was confident, so he headed down, he undogged the forward hatch, he swung it inside, he climbed in with his flashlight, and then somehow, once he got inside, he managed to fall backwards and hit the hatch door so hard that it swung shut, slammed, causing the upper dog to swivel and rotate down and lock him inside. He knew that nobody knew he was in there. He had made sure that nobody knew he was in there. He screamed for help, but nobody could hear him. The ship was so loud as it was, and being inside of this tunnel, no sounds getting out of it. And so he's looking around thinking what he should do, and he looks back at the door, the one that's sealed right behind him, and he sees the very top crack, there's a tiny sliver of light. Because even though one dog had sealed him in, because the other two had not, there was a little gap in the seal. And so he thought if he can just wedge his dirty rag into that little space and push it out onto the other side, someone will see it, will clearly recognize there's a foreign object hanging off of the forward hatch, and they'll have to open it up and they'll find me. And so once he wedged his rag up and through, he was confident he would be found, and so he slouched down against the back of the hatch and he just sat there waiting to be found. And then a little while later, he heard the sound of somebody not opening the hatch behind him as he thought they would, but instead locking the two dogs, making sure it doesn't open. He must have got up and turned around and screamed for them, but again, they can't hear him. And then a couple of minutes later, on the other side of the tube, 55 feet away, the aft hatch opened up briefly. Somebody shined their light in. It didn't hit him. He tried to yell for them. They didn't hear him. And then he saw them shut the hatch, and he heard the sound of them locking all three dogs. At this point, you got to figure that Kurt's fear is at a primal level. He knows at any moment, if somebody doesn't get him out of here, this is going to become a death trap. And so as he's looking around, just wondering what's going to happen, he would have felt the incredible pressure start to build up in his ears. It would have taken him to his knees, it would have been crushing in his skull, and he would have heard the sound of each of the hatches being pressed up against their O-ring as the room began to pressurize. And then he would have heard the sound of the pistons beginning to churn inside of the engine cylinder right next to him. And at that point, he would know there's no hope. And slowly, horribly, that room would begin to heat.
Next story.
Very popular Russian Instagram influencer named Ekterina Didenko was getting ready to celebrate her 29th birthday. She, along with her husband and some of her influencer friends, were planning to enjoy the occasion at a popular spa in Moscow, Russia. The group rented out a private section of the spa that included a steam room and a small indoor pool. And then once the reservations were made, Didenko and all of her influencer friends began eagerly talking about how excited they were about this party on their various social media accounts. When the day finally came, February 28th, which was Didenko's birthday, Didenko, her husband, and the 8 other people they invited, they all descended on this spa. So they go inside, they go back to their private area, and it's great. There's food, there's alcohol, there's music, music, they're jumping into the pool, then getting in the hot tub, and everyone's just having a great time. Everyone's taking pictures and filming and live streaming. I mean, it's really going as well as it possibly could be. And then at some point, Didenko's husband signals the rest of the group, minus Didenko, and they all begin to pull out these white hazardous materials suits. Imagine what you would see in a movie if there was some huge chemical leak, a full body white suit with a mask. And so they're all putting on these hazmat suits, and they give one to Didenko, who puts it on as well, and they tell her this is part of her big surprise. Now, it's unclear if Didenko actually didn't know what was going to happen next, or if she's just pretending to be surprised because it would do better on social media, because this is all being filmed and she's an influencer. But either way, she puts on her hazmat suit, and once everyone has their suits on, Didenko's husband wheeled in this huge cooler like you would bring to a picnic, and he placed it right on the edge of the pool. When he opened the lid, the crowd all gasped and laughed and smiled and filmed as these huge clouds of smoke or steam came pouring out of it. What it was roughly 55 pounds of dry ice. Dry ice is just frozen carbon dioxide. It's commonly used for things like refrigerating perishable goods for long periods of time because dry ice stays cold for a really long time. Also, because of the huge white gas clouds that come off of dry ice, it's also very commonly used as a sort of spooky decoration because you have these very cool white clouds going everywhere. And in fact, that's what Didenko's husband planned to use this dry ice for. He was going to dump it into the pool and create those big white gas clouds all over the pool. The reason they call it dry ice is because as it starts to heat up, it doesn't melt into a liquid state the way frozen water does. Instead, it goes directly from a solid state to a gas state. Dry ice is considered to be quite hazardous if it's handled inappropriately, and while these partygoers all had their hazmat suits on, it's unlikely they were actually wearing them for safety. It's far more likely they were wearing them because it would look good on social media and would kind of hype up the stunt they were about to do. And so after the dry ice was revealed inside of this cooler, Didenko's husband and another of the partygoers grabbed the sides of the cooler and they dumped its contents directly into the water. And as soon as the dry ice hit the water, it rapidly began to warm up, which caused a massive, almost explosion of carbon dioxide gas to completely fill the lower half of the room. Now, none of the partygoers are even a little bit fazed by what's happening. They don't realize how dangerous this actually is. And so they're just filming and laughing and kind of thinking this is so funny. And then Didenko's husband actually leaps through the cloud into the water and kind of disappears below. And then shortly after that, two other partygoers would also leap into the pool. One of the main reasons dry ice is considered to be so hazardous if handled inappropriately is because dry ice emits that carbon dioxide gas, which at high concentrations will displace oxygen. So imagine if you're in a very small room that has very poor ventilation. If you had lots of carbon dioxide in there, you would suffocate. And so this indoor pool was a small confined space with poor ventilation. And so the 7 people on the pool deck, shortly after this dry ice has been tossed into the pool, they started to realize it was really hard to breathe because the oxygen was basically being sucked out of the room. And so they were able to turn and actually run out of the pool deck before it was too late. Meanwhile, Didenko's husband and the other 2 people who leapt into the pool, when they came back to the surface, they breathed in thinking they would be breathing in oxygen, but instead they breathed in an entire lungful of carbon dioxide, which in addition to displacing oxygen at higher concentrations inside of confined spaces with poor ventilation, it is also poisonous at higher concentrations inside of confined spaces with poor ventilation. And so when the 3 of them surfaced, they breathed in this poisonous gas, which caused 2 of them to immediately pass out and then just die, while the third, Didenko's husband, he managed to stay conscious enough that he was able to climb barely out of the pool, and he tried to get to the door, but he couldn't get out in time. Eventually, he was pulled out and rushed to the hospital, but he would later die, not only from carbon dioxide poisoning, but also from having gone without.
Next story.
Early in July of 1982, a corrections officer made his rounds at a jail in San Jose, California. Everything seemed normal as he inspected each inmate's cell. But as the guard peered into the last cell on the row, he was startled by what he saw. The inmate was sitting on his bunk, staring forward, his mouth hanging open. He looked completely frozen,
almost like something out of a wax museum. The guard gave the cell door a few loud knocks with his flashlight, but the inmate didn't move or even blink. The guard was afraid that the inmate was dead. So he unlocked the door and stepped into the cell, and he got right up next to the inmate, and when he did, he could feel breath coming from the man's open mouth. So he knew he was alive. He gently touched the inmate to try to get him to react, but he didn't, and that gentle tap made the man's whole body rock back and forth on the bunk like a rocking chair. The guy was stiff as a board. The guard had no idea what was going on, and he was feeling very freaked out. But then he noticed the inmate's eyes. They had a look of absolute terror in them.
Next story.
Coming from the other end of the phone. But one group of dispatchers out of Reno, Nevada may win the award for the creepiest 911 calls ever received. When the details of these calls they got were put online, the internet went crazy. Here is their story. There was this old couple that lived about 20 miles east of Reno, Nevada. In 2010, the husband dies, leaving the wife all alone in this house. Shortly after his passing, she began calling 911 2-3 times a week, requesting things like, "Can you please put some water on to boil? Hey, can you change the thermostat?" It was clear she was showing signs of dementia, and the dispatchers were respectful of her and gently told her that this is 911, you can only call if it's an emergency, and at some point the woman would understand her mistake and she would say sorry and she would hang up. No first responders were ever sent out for these calls because it didn't seem like an emergency, it just seemed like a confused elderly person. But no matter how many times they told her, she kept calling back. And eventually her calls took a turn. Instead of calling 911 to ask for help with mundane tasks around the house, she would call 911 believing she was talking directly to her deceased husband, John. The dispatcher would pick up and the woman would say, "John, where are you? John, John." By this time, the dispatchers had gotten so many calls from this woman, they would recognize her address coming through and they knew what to expect. They would answer the phone, they'd be respectful, and they would tell her, like they always did, "This is 911, you can't call here, you need to talk to your family." And again, they did not send a responding unit out to her because it just seemed like she was confused, not in any danger. But one day when she called, she sounded frantic and scared.
"John, please come home, help me, I need help. John, come home."
This time, they would send first responders out to the woman's house. When the responding unit arrives at her house just minutes after she had placed the 911 call, they go to the door and they're knocking and they're yelling for her and she's not coming to the door and it's all quiet in the house. The door's unlocked, so they open it up and they announce themselves. They walk inside and immediately they can tell the heat is not on because it's very, very cold inside the house. They look around the first floor and they can't find her, and there's no sign of a struggle or any obvious problems that could have happened inside of the house. So they go upstairs and they start searching all the rooms and no one's there until they get to the last room, and it's the bedroom. They go inside and there's an older woman who's lying on the bed and she's clearly deceased and has been for several hours because rigor mortis had already set in. The police are able to confirm that the woman who's lying on the bed is the same woman who owns the house and lives there. And at this point, they call back to dispatch and they tell them, "Hey, you know, the woman that you claim made this 911 call, well, it can't have been her. Because based on rigor mortis, she was dead at the time that 911 call was made." But the dispatchers are like, "No way. We know what she sounds like. We speak to her multiple times a week. We have a whole protocol built when we see her address come across because we speak to her so often. That 911 call that you got that led you to that house where she was, that call was made by her." What they ultimately decide is the reason for this discrepancy is she didn't have rigor mortis. She was just stiff because it was really cold inside of her house, and that she had died in those couple of minutes between leaving the 911 call and when officers arrived. But in the back of everybody's minds, they're a little freaked out. A few days go by and another call is placed to 911 coming from that woman's home address. The dispatcher sees that and has to do a double take, like that's not possible. But they're thinking, okay, this could be a relative, it could be a friend, it could be anything. Picks up the phone and she's shocked when it's the same woman who is frantically yelling for John to come here, save me, help me, I need help. And the dispatcher, who's well aware of the history and well aware that this woman's supposed to be dead, stays calm, goes through the procedure, tries to get more information from this woman, but the call ends abruptly and there's no more information to be had. And so not knowing what else to do, she asks a responding unit to go check this house out. The responding unit goes over to the property. They knock on the door. No one's inside. The door is actually still open. They go in. The house is empty. There's no one there. There's no one that could have made that call. At this point, dispatch is like, okay, this has got to be a prank. But the next day, same thing happens. Here comes a call from the dead woman's house. They pick it up and it's this distraught woman yelling for help. I need my husband. And the dispatcher is trying to get more information, but they can't. And then the line cuts out. Once again, they have to send responders to this location because this woman has called 911 and is saying that she needs help. And once again, the officers get to the house and it's vacant. Just like when she was alive, these calls would persist multiple times a week. They continued even after her house was broken into and burned to the ground. There's not even a house anymore. And there are still calls coming through from that address to 911. Finally, the police get in touch with the phone company and they explain the situation, and the phone company looks at their records and they say, actually, her phone line was disconnected almost immediately after she was deceased. But they tell police there's a chance that it might not have been disconnected properly at the site, and that could be a reason why it's still working. So they send a lineman to go check out the actual property to confirm her lines were disconnected properly and that no wires were getting crossed, and he said all of it checked out. Everything has been detached this whole time. The phone company thought perhaps there was a digital recording of her that got trapped in their system and was randomly bouncing to their call center. But the dispatchers would say, it doesn't sound like a recording that's playing the same every single time. It's always the same message. She's yelling for her husband to come save her. But the way she sounds is always different. It's a unique phone call every single time. So because there wasn't a definitive explanation for why this was happening, they had to treat each call like it was serious. And so multiple times a week for a year, they received these ghost calls and had to send out responding officers to check on her. Even though the house was gone and there was nothing there and there was never anyone there. It was just a vacant lot. And then finally, a year after this woman has died, the calls just abruptly stopped. And the police did not launch an investigation into what it was, because the reality is police need to prioritize things that are threats to people or places. And this really wasn't either of those things. It was just really bizarre. And so the official explanation for how a dead woman could be calling 911 from a non-existent phone line in a non-existent house for a year is...
Next story.
Semester at a college in Louisiana when he met another senior, a wonderful young lady named Kayla. From the instant he saw her, he knew he was in love. She played hard to get at first, but after several months, he won her over. After graduation, the pair stayed in Louisiana and moved in together while they got their careers off the ground. 2 years later, the pair got married, and almost immediately, Kayla got pregnant. At the time, Mitch's career was really starting to take off, which allowed Kayla to stay at home and take some time off. By the time their daughter was born, Mitch was making so much money that Kayla decided to just stay home and be a full-time mom. A couple years later, Kayla got pregnant again, and by the time their daughter was 2 years old, they had their son. Mitch adored his children. Every morning before he went to work, he would sneak into their room and he would watch them sleep. And then in the evenings, they would have these big family sit-down meals and then play games together until bedtime. Mitch's life was perfect. Shortly after his son's birth, Mitch was lounging on the couch in his TV room when he noticed out of the corner of his eye the red lamp in the corner of the room. It just looked funny. It was almost like the light itself was blurry, but when he looked a little bit closer at it, the entire lamp looked blurry. And so Mitch looked around the room and nothing else was blurry. He rubbed his eyes and looked back over at this lamp and it was still blurry. He turned the TV off and walked over to the lamp, and even though he was right in front of it, the lamp was still blurry. And Mitch didn't have bad eyesight, and so he's thinking, is there something wrong with me? Am I having a stroke? Do I have an aneurysm? Is there some sort of illness here that's making me see this lamp blurry when it's really not? But Mitch told himself he was healthy and that whatever this was, it was an anomaly and nothing to worry about. And so he went back over to the couch, turned the TV back on, and tried to ignore the lamp. But as he was watching TV, out of his peripheral vision, he couldn't help but notice this weird blurry lamp. And so finally, he turned the TV off again, and he turned to look at this lamp. And now, in addition to being blurry, it appeared to be upside down. Now Mitch was genuinely concerned that there was something wrong with him, because again, nothing else in the entire room was blurry or upside down. It was just this lamp. And so a few minutes later, his wife and his kids came home, and Mitch decided he would not tell them about this lamp. He didn't want to alarm them. He figures he will get to the bottom of this blurry lamp, and then he will tell his wife and kids. And so that night, the family has a sit-down meal, and then afterwards they play some games together, and then everybody goes upstairs and goes to sleep. But after everyone had gone to sleep, Mitch was just laying in bed thinking about this lamp. And so finally, he snuck out of his bed and went downstairs to the TV room, and he sat on the couch, and he just stared at this lamp. And for hours and hours, he just fixated himself on this lamp, watching it kind of morph around and turn upside down and get blurrier and blurrier by the second. The next day, Kayla found Mitch lying on the couch, passed out, and she asked him if he was okay. And again, Mitch didn't tell her about this lamp that was still blurry. He just told her that he wasn't feeling well and he was not going to go to work that day. But Mitch didn't go to work for 3 more days. He just sat on the couch and stared at this lamp. And Kayla obviously picked up on this strange behavior and kept poking and prodding to get more information about what was going on. But Mitch never told her the truth about this lamp. He just kept telling her he felt sick. She urged him to go see a doctor, but Mitch told her it would be fine, he'd get better. And then over time, as this lamp continued to morph and get bigger and get stranger and stranger, Mitch suddenly was unable to respond to his wife. He became totally unresponsive. And so obviously his wife became desperate and called the doctor. And as she's on the phone with the doctor trying to get advice about what to do, Mitch realizes the lamp is now growing in leaps and bounds. And before long, the lamp is the entire size of the room, and all he can see is the red color of this lamp. And then Mitch starts to hear these voices, these screams coming from somewhere in the distance. And then he feels this blinding pain in his head. And then he opens his eyes. And he looks up and he sees he's laying on the sidewalk next to one of the buildings at his college in Louisiana. And surrounding him is this crowd of people with wide eyes that are staring at him. Mitch had no idea what was going on, and so he naturally just began scanning the crowd, looking for Kayla and his kids to try to figure out, how he got here. But before he could ask any questions and before he could find his wife and kids, a police officer ran through the crowd, picked him up and ran him over to his police car, put him in the back, and then began driving away. And so while Mitch is in the back of this police car, he turns to the officer and he says, "What's going on?" And the officer would tell him he was attacked by a huge college football player. He got hit in the head and he fell backwards and he hit his head again and he fell unconscious. Mitch asked the officer where his wife and kids were, and the cop said he had no idea. And that's when it clicked for Mitch. The lamp wasn't real. Neither was his wife, neither was his daughter, neither was his son, neither was his life. For the past 10 years, it was all a hallucination while he was unconscious after getting attacked. Mitch was brought to the hospital where he would make a full physical recovery, but after being released, he was horribly depressed, and he had to get intense therapy to basically grieve for the loss of his family that never existed. These days, Mitch says he can barely remember what his family even looked like, but periodically in his dreams, he will catch a glimpse of his son in his peripheral vision, and his son is perpetually 5 years old, and he's trying to talk to his father, but Mitch can never understand.
Next story.
In a boat just off the coast of Aberdeen, Scotland, and you cruise eastward, after about 7 hours, depending on your speed and the weather, you would come across this massive man-made structure jutting up out of the ocean. It looks like a cross between a construction site and a corporate office building sitting on top of 100-foot-tall metal stilts. It's called MrBallen, and it is an offshore oil rig, and it will remain in place until all the oil has been sucked up in that area. The people who work, often for weeks or months at a time, on rigs like MrBallen are known as roughnecks, and they have one of, if not the most dangerous job in the world. All exterior surfaces on these offshore rigs are always slick, either with water or oil, and so there is a constant risk of falling, sometimes hundreds of feet. If you're up on a higher platform, you could fall to a lower platform, which could be fatal, or you could fall clean off the rig all the way to the ocean 100 plus feet below. If you add in some bad windy weather, the risk of falling increases tenfold. Also, the crude oil that these roughnecks are drilling for is highly combustible, and so fires are a huge concern as well. And if that wasn't risky enough, there's also this phenomenon known as a blowout, where basically the oil well that the drill is actually drilling into will just explode. Now, all rigs have some sort of mitigating equipment to try to save themselves in case this occurs, but in reality, if it happens, happens and you are unfortunately near the drill when it happens, you are likely to be killed or maimed. While the downsides of working on an oil rig are fairly obvious, the upsides are too. Namely, your pay is fantastic. In 2000, a 41-year-old father of two named Gordon Moffat was a roughneck working on the Magellan. His primary job was to perform maintenance on the drill. Now, these offshore rigs work great most of the time, but they do have a habit of breaking down fairly often. And for a drilling company, anytime they are not sucking out crude oil, they're losing money. And so it was just a known thing when you worked on one of these rigs that as soon as there is an issue that causes the drill to stop working, it must be fixed immediately. Whether it's day, night, horrible weather, good weather, it didn't matter. It had to be fixed right away. And so on the night of October 9th that year, Gordon had just gotten back to his quarters to end the day when he got a call on his radio that he was actually needed to come back out to fix a problem that had stopped the drill. Now, Gordon was a seasoned roughneck and he had grown quite accustomed to these late night calls to go out and fix things. And so he wasn't annoyed. He just put his stuff back on, turned around, and he headed out the door. When Gordon got to the main deck, which is this wide open metal platform right in the middle of the rig where the drill actually passes down through it on its way to the ocean, when he got to the main deck, he was met by some of his co-workers who told him where he would need to go. The cabling that needed fixing was located right below the main deck. However, it was not accessible from the main deck. In order for Gordon to get to it, he would need to go down to the next lowest platform from the main deck. Basically, he would need to hop in an elevator and go down one floor. And from this lower deck, the crew on the main deck would lower down a harness attached to a long wire. They would feed it down through this hole in the main deck platform called a mouse hole. It was about 10 inches across, and they would feed it down, and he would grab the harness, he would put it on, and then he would signal up to the main deck crew who could literally see him through this mouse hole. They would turn around and they would signal somebody called the hoist operator, and they were located above the main deck, slightly back. They couldn't actually see Gordon, so they're relying on communications with the people on the main deck. And the hoist operator would start their winch, and a winch basically reels in the wire that was connected to the harness that was on Gordon. And so once the hoist operator was informed, he'd turn on the winch, and then Gordon would be raised up until he could access these cables, and then he'd do his maintenance and be lowered back down, and that would be it. Now, Gordon and the crew had done maintenance using this winch system many times before, so this was a very routine fix. So Gordon made his way from the main deck down to the slightly lower deck, and he looked up at the mouse hole, and he watched as the main deck crew members lowered the harness with the wire attached to it down through the mouse hole. And so Gordon grabbed the harness, he put it around his waist, and he secured it. And after he was sure it was on correctly, he signaled up to the crew on the main deck that he was ready to start, and they in turn turned around. They flagged the hoist operator who started the winch. And so very slowly, Gordon was lifted off the platform he was standing on, and he was brought up after several minutes, all the way up about 10 feet to access these cables. And as soon as he was parallel with them, he waved to the main deck crew, who were not far from him at this point, and he said, "I'm good." And so they turned around, they told the hoist operator, who stopped the winch. And so Gordon got his tools out and he began working on these cables, and the whole time he's trying to stay in one place because the wind is whipping through and he's kind of dangling and swinging around. And then eventually he finishes the repair, the cables are good, and so he signals the crew on the main deck through the mouse hole that he was good to go. "You can lower me back down now." And so the main deck crew, they turn, they wave to the hoist operator to go ahead and lower Gordon, and the hoist operator, he gives the thumbs up and he starts the winch. However, the hoist operator accidentally forgot to switch the direction of the winch. And so when he started it again, instead of the winch spooling the wire out and lowering Gordon, it continued to reel the wire in, pulling Gordon upward. Now, the winch did not move very quickly, and so it wasn't like Gordon is rocketing up towards the mouse hole. However, this problem was immediately recognized by Gordon and the main deck crew, and so they're frustrated. They're yelling up at the hoist operator saying, "Stop, stop, stop, reverse the winch." They're all waving and flagging this guy down. But the hoist operator, after he had hit start on the winch, had just kind of turned around, because this is a routine thing they've done a million times before. And so he's not looking at the crew on the main deck. So he has no idea what's going on. And it was so windy and loud that night on board the rig that he couldn't hear their cries. And so the winch just continued to reel in the wire, slowly raising Gordon closer closer and closer to the mouse hole. Now, Gordon could not get out of his harness unless he was on the platform below. So there was no way to escape the situation he was in. And so Gordon, after a few seconds of this not stopping and him continuing upward, he starts screaming. He's not annoyed anymore. He's terrified. And so is the crew on the main deck. They are now frantically screaming at the hoist operator to stop the winch, but nothing is working. And so one of the main deck crew members, sensing that they need to do something different to get this guy's attention, he runs away from where the mouse hole is to this nearby phone. And this phone is connected up to the hoist operator station, and he picks it up and it starts dialing. Up in the hoist operator station, he's still not paying attention when the phone rings. He grabs the phone, puts it to his ear, and immediately he's hit with screams to stop the winch. And so the hoist operator, totally confused, whips around and hits stop on the winch. But it was too late. Just a few moments earlier, Gordon had finally been pulled all the way up right to the entrance of the underside of this mouse hole. And as he reached this hole, he tried to position himself in a vertical position so that maybe he could slip his upper body into the hole and he could just kind of slide through the hole. He'd still be hurt by it, but it would limit the damage. However, because of his harness being on his waist right in front of him, he couldn't get himself into a vertical position. He could only lay back in a horizontal one. And so when he reached the underside of the main deck and he's looking right at this mouse hole, he just put his arms and his legs out and tried to push himself back as if he could fight the winch and keep himself from going into this hole. But there was nothing he could do. And so his pelvis first was pulled into the 10-inch hole. And as his body begins to literally break in half, he's screaming out in pain. And then by the time the hoist operator had hit stop, Gordon was already deceased, and only a section of his torso actually made it up through the hole. Gordon's company was found guilty of being blatantly delinquent on many safety protocols, and so they were fined £60,000, and then they
Next story.
paid an undisclosed amount to Gordon's family.
On the afternoon of January 22nd, 2024, an elderly woman named Janet Lee sat in front of her computer in an office on the second floor of her home in Newcastle, England. She was going over some recent bank statements, but it was kind of hard. She was distracted because all she could hear was her boyfriend downstairs talking to someone. So Janet's boyfriend was a guy named Richard O'Connell, and he and Janet had been together for about 20 years. Now, despite not officially being married, they sort of functioned like a married couple. They lived together, they shared everything. In fact, Janet had even written Richard into her will. Janet thought her and Richard would be together forever. I mean, clearly, if you're writing him into your will. And she assumed that that feeling was reciprocated, that Richard also felt like they were together forever. But lately, their relationship had gotten pretty rocky, and in fact, both of them had begun openly talking about the possibility that they might need to break up. Now, nothing was set in stone, and by no means were they destined for a breakup, but it was suddenly, a possibility, and that was really hard for Janet to deal with. And so, as Janet sat upstairs trying to do these bank statements, but, getting completely sidetracked just by the sound of Richard's voice, part of the reason that was so distracting is, Richard was all she could think about. What would happen if they broke up? What would her life look like? And so before long, her mind was kind of wandering, and no longer was it the bank statements. It was, what does the future hold for me? It seems so uncertain. And so as Janet is having this moment upstairs, she suddenly hears Richard start yelling downstairs. And at first, it kind of sounded like maybe he was yelling at the person he had been talking to. But the more Janet listened, she could tell it really wasn't that he was yelling as much as he was screaming, like he was screaming out in pain or something. And so Janet got out of her chair and ran downstairs to see what was going on. And when she did, she looked towards the front door and she saw there was this man who she didn't recognize, but he looked weirdly familiar to her. He was wearing a white lab coat, his back was to her, and he was walking out the front door. And before she could even begin to process who this guy was and what he was doing here, she heard the sound of Richard again kind of calling out in pain, less loudly this time, but definitely in real pain. And she turned, and sure enough, there was Richard in the living room, clutching his shoulder and grimacing like something was really hurting him. And so Janet, she walked over to him and she's like, what's going on? Like, what's wrong with you? And who was that guy? And tell me, what's happening here? And so Richard, through gritted teeth, would tell her that he had just gotten a COVID vaccine shot and it really hurt. And that guy who had just given it to him was a guy from NHS, the National Health Service, and he just came by to administer the shot. And so Janet heard what he said, but it wasn't really computing. Like, why aren't you getting the shot done at the doctor's office? Why are you having somebody come here to administer it? That's unusual. But, as she was thinking about this, she could clearly see that what was really important right now was that Richard was in agonizing pain. I mean, he was holding his arm and kind of rocking back and forth, moaning. Clearly, he was having some sort of reaction to the shot. And so she forgot about the weirdness around why he got the shot and how he got the shot, and said to him, like, hey, do you want to go to the hospital? I can drive you. And at this, Richard kind of sat up straight and took a deep breath, clearly trying to calm himself down. And even though obviously his shoulders still hurt from the shot, he said to Janet that, the guy from the NHS told me this was normal. There's pain associated with this particular shot, and it would just go away on its own. And so I'm just gonna wait and let this thing fade. At this point, Janet was still worried about Richard, but, he seemed pretty confident that this was not a big deal. And so she decided she would simply follow his lead. And she said, okay, if that's what you want to do. And then she turned and she went upstairs and continued trying to do her bank statements. But 2 days later, Janet did end up driving Richard to the hospital. Because over those 48 hours since Richard got that COVID shot, the spot on his arm, the injection site, had turned red and began to blister and bleed. And then eventually it turned black. And so at that point, they went to the ER. Hospital doctors would diagnose Richard with something called necrotizing fasciitis, which is a bacterial infection more commonly known as flesh-eating disease. Basically, the skin and muscle of Richard's arm was dying and rotting, but from the inside out. The doctors told Richard he would have to have emergency surgery to remove the rotting flesh to stop the spread of this infection. But before they could even do that, they needed to figure out how this infection had even begun. And so at this point, Richard began telling the doctors all about how, 2 days earlier he'd gotten his COVID shot, and pretty much right away it had been so painful, and then it blistered and bled and turned black. And then also, over the course of this discussion that Janet is listening to as well, Richard began describing the NHS guy who had actually come to his house. Now remember, Janet had only seen this guy for a brief second when she had run downstairs. She had seen him walking out the front door, she just saw the white lab coat, but something about him seemed weirdly familiar, but she kind of put that thought out of her mind. But now, as she's listening to Richard describe this NHS guy with a little more detail this time, suddenly something clicked. She realized she knew why this guy seemed so familiar. And this realization filled her with horror. It would turn out that NHS nurse was not really an NHS nurse. Instead, they were a man that both Janet and Richard knew very well. However, they were extremely well disguised, and so Janet and Richard did not recognize them. This man's name was Thomas Kwan. And Thomas, after coming inside their home, did not inject Richard with COVID-19 vaccine. Instead, he injected Richard with a deadly pesticide called iodomethane. That pesticide immediately caused that excruciating pain that Richard was feeling that caused him to scream out, and ultimately killed and began to rot away the flesh in his arm. It would turn out Thomas Kwan was Janet's son, and he was furious at her for putting Richard in her will and allowing Richard to get her house when she died. And so he decided he would basically inject poison into Richard, killing Richard to secure the house for himself. But Richard would survive the ordeal. He would have to undergo several pretty intense surgeries, but he ended up being okay. As for Thomas, he was arrested and convicted of attempted murder and sentenced to
Next story.
Up until Kurt was cooked alive.
One morning in February of 1987, a 45-year-old woman named Janet Overton stood in front of her bathroom mirror inside of her home in Dana Point, California. Janet was a member of the board for the school district that her 17-year-old son attended, and she had a big meeting that day. But as she looked at herself in the mirror, she looked terrible. She was pale and exhausted, and she had these big dark circles under her eyes. Now, Janet knew why she looked this way. It's because the last couple of days, she'd felt really sick, kinda out of nowhere. She'd been all stuffed up, she had bouts of nausea off and on, she wasn't sleeping very well. She figured she just had a bad cold and hoped if she could just kind of muscle her way through it, she could avoid going to the doctor. But now here she was about to have this big school board meeting, still feeling sick, still looking terrible. But instead of kind of canceling her plans and going to the doctor, she just caked on more makeup, did up her hair, and headed out the door. A few weeks later, Janet suddenly woke up in the middle of the night feeling so nauseous that she leapt out of her bed and ran to the bathroom and vomited. And then afterwards, she just sat on the ground, sweating and shaking. So over the last few weeks, Janet's cold had not really gone away. In fact, if anything, it had just gotten progressively worse. Now, Janet had gone to the doctor about it eventually, and the doctor had agreed with her that, maybe you do have some really bad cold or some other virus here. But the only thing they told her to do was just, rest and stay really well hydrated, and whatever this is, it'll just run its course. And so that's exactly what Janet had been doing over these several weeks, but it hadn't helped. Janet's nausea had gotten so bad and so severe that she basically couldn't eat. And then she had also fallen behind on her work for the school board because she was so weak all the time. Janet forced herself to stand up off the bathroom floor, then she turned on the sink and began splashing cold water on her face. But as she did that, she noticed something new. She saw there was this red, scaly rash on her arms. And so she stepped back and pulled her sleeves up, and she saw the rash extended up onto her shoulders and up onto her neck and down her back. And when she touched it, it really hurt. I mean, this is a brand new symptom here, and she could tell it had to be connected to whatever this mystery illness was, and it terrified her. Like, what was happening to her body? And so she decided that night she had to go to the ER. The next day, Janet laid in a hospital bed with an IV in her arm and her husband and her son sitting right beside her. She still felt absolutely horrible. She still felt nauseous, she had cold symptoms, and that rash had now spread up to her neck and onto her face, and it had begun to blister. All night, the doctors had been running tests on Janet to try to figure out what was going on. But every test they ran came back negative. She didn't have the flu, and she didn't have at least any known infections or diseases that could cause these symptoms. And so the doctors were at a loss. However, scans of Janet's abdomen did reveal something concrete. She had all these ulcers in her stomach, which basically are like open sores in her stomach lining. And so the doctors told her very likely it was these ulcers that were causing her extreme nausea and making it really hard to eat. But like everything else they were seeing with Janet, they had no idea why she was developing these ulcers in the first place. And so ultimately, all the doctors could really do for Janet was just treat her symptoms. They gave her ulcer medication, and they also gave her some topical treatments for her rash. And over the next couple of days, these treatments seemed to work. Her ulcers went away, and her rash basically disappeared, and overall she felt a lot better. Not back to 100%, but pretty close, to the point where she was discharged. And so Janet and the doctors were like, okay, we don't really know what this was or why it started. We just hope it never comes back. Several months later, on January 24th, 1988, Janet was at home getting ready for a whale watching trip with her 17-year-old son, and she felt horrible. Ever since leaving the hospital, she had periodically just kept getting sick over and over and over again. And each time she would go back to the hospital and they would just, treat her symptoms because no one could figure out what was wrong with her. And then eventually she'd get better and go back home and the cycle would repeat. And so on this particular day, even though Janet felt sick as a dog, she just told herself she was going to push through this and try to have a good day with her son on this whale watching trip. So she put on a ton of makeup, she put her hair up, slammed some coffee, and then went downstairs to meet her son. Then the two of them headed outside, walked over to the car, and right as Janet was about to grab the car door handle and get inside, she stood there for a second and then just collapsed. Janet's husband and son immediately rushed Janet to the hospital, but by the time they got there, it was already too late. Janet was dead. Her doctors were obviously baffled because they had been baffled for months now. Nobody knew what was happening to her. And so ultimately they brought in a coroner to do an autopsy to try to figure out once and for all what was going on with Janet. And as soon as the coroner cut open Janet's stomach to examine the contents, he was hit with this smell that was very distinct that instantly told him exactly what had killed Janet. And as soon as he smelled it, he stopped what he was doing and contacted the police. And the police immediately sent detectives to Janet's house, and they began gathering up all these items inside the house to be tested. And the results of these tests confirmed the coroner's theory. As Janet got sicker and sicker, She had this mentality of like, I'm gonna push through this thing and not go to the doctor. I'm just gonna pretend this isn't even happening. And so when she was caking on all that makeup every day and chugging all this coffee, to combat the tiredness, that was all just an effort to, pretend this wasn't really happening. But what she didn't realize is that the makeup and the coffee were actually killing her. It would turn out there was a deadly chemical in her makeup called selenium that was slowly killing her. And then in her coffee was cyanide. And cyanide has a very distinctive smell. It smells like almonds, and that's what the coroner smelled when he opened up her stomach. But these deadly chemicals did not appear in her makeup and coffee naturally. They were put there by Janet's husband. He believed Janet was having an affair, and so he set out to murder her. He first began placing the selenium in her makeup, and it was slowly killing Janet, but it was not happening fast enough. And so finally, on the day of the whale watching trip, her husband put the cyanide in her coffee, and it killed her pretty much right away. Richard Overton was convicted of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced.
Next story.
All right, let's get into gathered at a restaurant for their annual New Year's Day lunch. But one member of this family who said they would be attending didn't show up. It was 50-year-old Stephen Winfrey, who was an unemployed, divorced father of two who in recent years had become quite depressed. When they reached out to him on his phone and he didn't pick up, the family pretty quickly started to worry that something could have happened to him, that, perhaps he did something to harm himself given his mental state. But his sister, Nadine, who was at this lunch, she reassured the rest of the family that she had spoken to Stephen the night before and he was in great spirits and had told her that his plan was to go rabbit hunting the next day on New Year's Day before heading over to the restaurant for lunch. And because Nadine knew that her brother recently had really taken a liking to rabbit hunting, it was one of the very few things that actually made him happy, she told the family, look, I bet you anything he just lost track of time and he will get here late, or maybe we won't see him at all, but at least he's out doing something that makes him happy. And so the family was reassured by this, and so they sat down at their table, they ordered their food, and the whole meal, everyone's kind of looking over at the front door, expecting Stephen to come strolling in at any minute. But when they finished up eating, he still had not arrived. And so as the family was getting ready to leave the restaurant and head back home, they all decided that, you know what, I'm sure Stephen is fine, he's doing something he loves, I'm sure he did just get carried away, and so we'll just wait for him to contact us. And so the family, they all leave the restaurant and they spend the rest of the day at their respective households, and then the following morning they all get in touch with each other and they discover that still no one has seen or heard from Stephen. And so at this point the family just felt like there was something off about this, and so they contacted the police and they reported him missing. As the police were getting ready to head out and begin looking for Stephen that day, they received a call. Stephen had been found. Although the exact details of what happened to Stephen may never be fully understood, this is the best theory that the police have come up with. On New Year's Day, January 1st, the day Stephen was supposed to meet his family for lunch, he had gotten up early and headed out to a nearby forested park to do some rabbit hunting, just like he told his sister he would be. He had gone to the park with his dog and some ferrets. The way Stephen caught rabbits is he would release these ferrets into various rabbit holes, and then he would stand back with his rifle and he would wait for the ferret to run the rabbits out of their holes, out into the open, and then he would raise his rifle and shoot at the rabbits, and then his dog would run over and grab the rabbit and bring it back to him. And so all morning long, he was doing this with relative success, and then something happened to where Stephen decided he needed to actually look inside of one of these rabbit holes. Perhaps one of his ferrets got stuck, or one of the rabbits got stuck, but either way, he wanted to look into the opening of one of these rabbit holes, and so he walked over to it, and apparently he couldn't quite see whatever it was he wanted to see, and so he got down on his hands and knees and stuck his head into this rabbit hole opening. Now, these openings to these rabbit holes are pretty narrow, and so once he forced his head inside, it got stuck. He could not pull it out again. And so all around the outside of this hole where his head was stuck, there were these deep divots that his hands had obviously dug once he realized he was stuck, because he was trying to dig the entrance a little bit wider to get his head out. But as he was working really hard and laboring to kind of dig this hole out, he was burning up the very limited amount of oxygen that was inside of this hole. And so very quickly, as he was trying to save himself, he would have started to struggle breathing because there just wasn't enough air in this hole. And so when it became clear he was starting to suffocate, he abandoned the approach of trying to dig himself out and began trying to contort his body outside of the hole at really extreme angles to try to pop his head out, even if it meant breaking his neck in the process. But no matter how hard he tried, he just could not get his head out. The following day, January 2nd at 4 p.m., this is after Stephen has been reported missing, a person walking through that forested park, they found Stephen. They saw his body poking out of that hole at a really extreme angle, and so they called the police. The police showed up to the park, and they confirmed that Stephen was dead. He had suffocated. His death was not ruled a suicide. It was determined to be an accident. As for Stephen's dog and his ferrets, they were found near his body.
Next story.
I never thought I'd tell. People who knew the main subject of this story said he never wanted it shared, yet the title came from his final written note in a sealed incident report. The story centered on a 40-year-old technician named Latham Royce, who worked for a regional utility company that serviced rural counties with long miles of aging power lines. He preferred quiet schedules and predictable routes, and he kept to himself outside of work. That day, he planned a routine inspection run toward a hillside substation that often suffered weather damage. He left his small office building shortly after sunrise and loaded his truck with standard tools and a handheld meter. He told dispatch he would check the substation, inspect a few nearby relay posts, and return before mid-afternoon. The weather looked clear and the roads felt familiar. Latham enjoyed the quiet drive because early routes rarely involved complicated repairs. He parked near the substation gate and listened to the hum from the transformers as he prepared his gear. The incident began when he walked toward the main relay cabinet and noticed the lock hanging open. The padlock sat on the ground as if placed carefully rather than dropped. He knelt to check for damage and saw faint scrape marks on the metal that suggested someone tried forcing the latch recently. He photographed the cabinet for documentation and radioed dispatch to report tampering. When no reply came, he assumed the signal dipped behind the hill and continued inspecting the site. He opened the cabinet and saw a thick strand of wire removed from its proper mount and laid across the bottom in a strange curved pattern. The wire showed no arc marks or heat damage, which ruled out common electrical faults. He traced the pattern with his eyes and realized it resembled a shaped track rather than loose wire placement. He took another photo and noted the direction of the curve in his log. The surrounding gravel showed footprints that did not match his boot style. The complication deepened when he followed the footprints toward a ridge behind the substation. The prints ended near a small patch of ash on the ground. The ash pile looked too neat and dense for normal debris. He used a small metal probe to lift a fragment and realized it came from burned paper. A partially intact corner displayed faint grid lines consistent with utility schematics. He searched the area and found a second fragment with the letters RO faintly visible. Latham felt uneasy because missing schematics indicated a serious breach. He stepped farther into the brush and found a small metal tag half buried under leaves. The number on the tag matched an older transformer once listed in a unit that had been replaced years earlier. He placed the tag in a sample bag and photographed the location. He sensed someone had walked the ridge recently. The branches along the narrow path leaned in one direction and showed fresh breaks. He radioed dispatch again, but only heard static. He climbed the ridge to get better reception and paused at the highest point. From there, he noticed a narrow service road that did not appear on his current map. The road looked recently used because tire grooves cut through the dirt with crisp edges. He followed the grooves for several yards and found a broken reflector post lying beside the path. The brake marks looked clean enough to be recent. A damp paper scrap fluttered between the weeds. He picked it up and saw part of a handwritten note. Only 3 words remained. Leave it covered. The ink smudged near the corner. He checked his surroundings and listened for movement. A metallic clink echoed from further down the hidden road. He walked cautiously and saw a relay junction box standing open with the cover resting neatly against a stump. Inside the box, he found a laminated tag that did not match any current company design. The investigation grew more complicated when he returned to the substation to run a full diagnostic check. His handheld meter showed healthy readings at every point except one large grounding conductor that displayed inconsistent spikes. The spikes resembled intentional interference rather than random fluctuations. He traced the grounding conductor to an old anchor point near the fence line. The soil around the anchor looked recently disturbed and darker than the surrounding dirt. He crouched to examine the soil and spotted a folded sheet tucked between two rocks. He pulled it free and realized it was a partially burned maintenance log from 1998. The log listed several relay inspections performed by a technician whose name he did not recognize. The final entry read something about a pattern found near the ridge and an instruction to secure the record until further review. No follow-up pages existed. Latham checked the substation perimeter again and noticed a small camera housing tucked near the base of a transformer that should not have had any surveillance attached. The housing held no active components. It was only a shell, yet someone had placed it deliberately to resemble a working device. Inside the shell, he found a cut strip of metallic tape containing faint impressions, like someone pressed a thin tool against it. He photographed it and stored it in his pack. He returned to the ridge with renewed caution. The tire tracks on the hidden road continued toward a section where the dirt thinned and revealed old concrete remains from a small demolished shed. Under a slab, he found another ash pile containing char marks consistent with burned notebook bindings. He collected samples and recorded the time. He noticed a torn binder ring half sunk into the soil. The ring held tiny flecks of paper around its hinge. As he moved past the slab, he heard a sound that made him stop. Someone called his name from the direction of the service road. He froze. He had not told anyone his location except dispatch, and dispatch never responded to his earlier calls. He waited for movement and called out who was there, but the voice did not answer. Instead, another metallic clink echoed across the clearing. The sound came from behind him this time. He turned quickly and saw no one. He stepped toward the road and heard his name again. Same tone and same distance. He felt his throat tighten because the voice matched his supervisor's voice almost perfectly. He tried the radio once more, but only static returned. He walked backward toward open ground while scanning the trees. The forest looked undisturbed, yet the voice repeated his name in the same calm tone. The timing felt off because the voice never shifted in volume or direction. Latham hurried to his truck and locked the doors. He started the engine and drove toward the main road. As he pulled away, he saw a figure standing at the ridge overlook. The figure wore a light jacket similar to the standard issue for his company. He slowed briefly to look. The figure never moved. The posture looked rigid and the face remained shadowed by the sun angle. He accelerated down the road until the figure vanished from view. Later that afternoon, he filed an incident report at the regional office. He provided photos of every detail: the curved wire pattern, the burned schematics, the old log page, the unusual tracks, the missing camera interior, the mysterious voice. He expected immediate follow-up, but the report moved into a restricted folder by the next morning. A supervisor told him to treat the event as a misunderstanding caused by outdated equipment and environmental interference. The twist arrived when an older technician approached him privately 2 days later. The man said he remembered a similar incident in 1998 involving unexplained interference and missing documents. He recalled a technician named Rourke who left the company suddenly after reporting a pattern near the ridge. The man said Rourke claimed someone else had spoken his name during the inspection, even though no one else was present. Latham checked archived notes and found a redacted summary describing a suspended review connected to the old substation. The summary listed several missing logbooks and referred to an unknown visitor observed near the ridge. The entry ended with a directive to discontinue further field checks of that area without written approval. Latham realized the burned papers matched the missing logs. He no longer doubted what happened at the ridge. Someone had tampered with the site long before his visit, and someone continued observing technicians who inspected the area. The voice that called his name likely came from a recording device or a hidden repeater used to lure him closer. He felt grateful he left as soon as he did. He added a final handwritten note to the report before sealing it. The button settled when Latham requested reassignment to a different region. He told a few close friends that he did not want that story shared, yet he felt relieved someone finally documented the evidence. He never again returned to the ridge. People who read the archive notes said his final line explained the title perfectly. He wrote that it was the most
Next story.
town horror stories that locals never talk about. Sultan, Washington remains a quiet region where the dense evergreens often hide the heavy morning mist in the early fall. Local residents usually avoid discussing the specific events that occurred near the edge of the Skycomish River during 2015. Records from the county sheriff indicate that several calls regarding unexplained activity originated from a single remote property that year. Investigators reportedly found the circumstances surrounding the inhabitants to be highly irregular based on the available dispatch logs from then. The following account details the documented experiences of 3 individuals who encountered something they simply could not easily explain. 32-year-old Mark Miller worked as a local timber surveyor who spent most of his days deep within the woods. He lived in a modest cabin with his younger brother David, who was 24 and worked as a seasonal mechanic. Their friend Sarah joined them during the autumn months to help renovate the aging structure before the harsh winter arrived. The group intended to finish the exterior repairs quickly so they could enjoy the isolation of the Washington wilderness. State records show that Mark had lived in the area for nearly a decade without reporting any significant safety issues. They did not realize that their presence on the property had been noted by someone or something in the brush. The dense forest surrounding the property was comprised of ancient cedar trees that effectively blocked out most of the natural sunlight. Archived notes from a previous land survey conducted in 2010 mentioned that the soil in this region was unusually soft. Mark discovered several sets of deep indentations in the earth that did not match any known wildlife species in the area. Some locals claimed that the property had a history of trespassing issues involving people who lived off the grid nearby. Investigators never confirmed the identity of these individuals because the dense terrain made tracking nearly impossible for the local authorities. The 3 friends began to feel a distinct sense of being watched from the dark shadows of the towering trees. Dispatch logs from late September 2015 indicate that Mark called the sheriff to report a series of loud metallic bangs. He stated that the noises seemed to originate from the corrugated metal roof of the tool shed behind the main cabin. David reportedly inspected the area with a high-powered spotlight, but he saw no one standing in the immediate vicinity. A county file from 2009 describes similar reports of vandalism that were never solved by the responding patrol officers. Sarah noted in her personal journal that the atmosphere on the property had changed from peaceful to something quite oppressive. They decided to install several motion-activated lights around the perimeter to ensure their safety during the long and dark nights. State records from October 2015 showed that the local power grid experienced several unexplained surges, specifically in the Sultan area. Sarah reportedly found that all of the heavy kitchen appliances had been moved several inches away from the wooden walls. She told the investigators that she heard the sound of slow breathing coming from the other side of her door. Records conflict regarding whether there were any signs of forced entry found by the officers who arrived later that evening. Some locals claimed that the cabin was built on top of an old mining shaft that created strange acoustic effects. The group became increasingly paranoid as they realized that their physical environment was being subtly altered by an unknown force. Archive notes from the county coroner mention a discovery of several dead animals that were arranged in a perfect circle. Mark found these remains near the edge of the clearing where he usually parked his heavy-duty timber hauling truck. Investigators never confirmed if the animals had been killed by a predator or if they were placed there by someone. The county file from 2009 mentions that a previous resident had reported finding similar patterns in the high grass. David reportedly began to suffer from severe sleep deprivation because he heard the sound of footsteps on the porch every night. He described the noise as a heavy dragging sound that lasted for several minutes before fading away into the deep woods. Dispatch logs from November 2015 record a second call regarding a security breach in the lower level of the cabin. David reportedly found the heavy iron padlock on the cellar door had been snapped off with a pair of bolt cutters. He told the deputy that nothing appeared to be missing from the storage area despite the door being left wide open. State records indicate that the officers found no fingerprints on the metal surface of the lock or the door handle itself. Some locals claimed that a group of transients was known to use the abandoned mining tunnels for shelter during the winter. Investigators never confirmed this theory because no one was ever located in the subterranean passages beneath the Sultan Forest area. Sarah reportedly captured a single grainy photograph of a figure standing near the tree line during the early hours of the morning. The image shows a tall and thin shape that appears to be wearing a dark hooded coat with no visible face. Archived notes from the sheriff department state that the photograph was too blurry to provide any useful evidence for a search. Records conflict on whether the figure was a physical person or simply a trick of the light among the tall trees. Mark decided to board up the lower windows of the cabin to prevent anyone from looking inside during the night. The three friends stopped leaving the house after the sun went down because the feeling of being hunted became too intense. The final entry in the county file from 2015 describes a massive disturbance that occurred on the 3rd of December. Dispatch logs indicate that a neighbor heard the sound of glass breaking, followed by several loud screams coming from the property. When the officers arrived, they found the front door standing open, and the interior of the cabin was in total disarray. State records show that a significant amount of blood was found on the kitchen floor, but no bodies were ever recovered. Investigators never confirmed the origin of the biological samples because the DNA profiles did not match any of the residents. Some locals claimed that they saw 3 people walking into the river, but these reports were never verified by the police. A massive search party was organized by the local community members who spent 3 weeks combing through the dense evergreen forest. Volunteers reportedly found a single piece of torn clothing that belonged to Sarah snagged on a thick branch near the river. State records indicate that the search was eventually called off due to the arrival of a severe winter storm that year. The investigators found several items of personal value scattered along a trail that led toward the highest peak in the region. Records conflict regarding whether the items were dropped in a hurry or if they were placed as markers for the police. No trace of Mark or David or Sarah was ever found despite the extensive efforts of the local search and rescue teams. The case remains unsolved in the archive notes of the Washington State Police as a mysterious disappearance with no clear motive. The property in Sultan was eventually sold to a private developer who demolished the cabin and cleared the surrounding forest area. County records from 2021 show that no further incidents have been reported on that specific piece of land since. People who live in the region still avoid the area near the Skycomish River when the heavy morning mist rolls in. They reportedly believe that some secrets are better left buried in the soft soil of the deep and dark Washington woods. The true fate of the 3 residents remains one of the greatest mysteries in
Next story.
promotion. Okay, back to the stories. Brian Joplin was born in 1972 and was raised in this tiny town in Oklahoma called Hugo. He was a big guy, so growing up, he was always encouraged to play football, and he did, but his real passion had always been working on cars. It was something he loved to do, and he was extremely good at doing. After he graduated high school, he stuck around in Hugo doing some auto body work, but he got this feeling that he should do something bigger with his life. And so in 1992, he decided to enlist in the United States Navy. This was something his family was extremely proud of him for doing, especially his grandfather, who had flown bomber planes during World War II. Following Brian's initial military training, better known as boot camp, he was sent to Aviation Machinist Mate School, which is a military school for military members that teaches you how to be a mechanic for all things that fly. And so after Brian breezed through the school, because he was already a very skilled mechanic, and so it came to him naturally, he was sent to his first duty Navy station out in California. And so he joins his California unit, and immediately he excels, and he becomes one of the very best mechanics at his unit, despite being one of the most junior. And while he was in California, he also met his wife, Belinda. And so over the next several years that he was in California, and then he moved around to Texas and a couple other places, he just continued to shine at work. And at home, he and his wife began building a family. They had 2 daughters. And so by and large, everything in Brian's life was going exactly to plan, until Brian made a terrible mistake. Fast forward to October 4th, 2005, and Brian, who was 32 at the time, was deployed with his unit to Bahrain, which is a country in the Persian Gulf. That particular day, Brian, along with 2 other mechanics from his unit and 2 pilots from his unit, had been tasked with flying from Bahrain north to Kuwait, which is another country in the Persian Gulf. This was a routine flight, about an hour long. It was one they had made several times during this deployment. Brian was not really looking forward to doing it, and neither were the other people that were on this particular flight. But Brian decided the way he would make this trip less monotonous and boring is he would perform the stunt. So Brian and the other 2 mechanics, they load in the back of this helicopter in the cargo area, so the passenger area of this helo, and the 2 pilots, they load into the cockpit. And within a couple of minutes, they were 125 feet off the ground, careening forward out over the Persian Gulf at over 120 miles an hour. Brian and the other 2 mechanics in the back of this craft had elected to keep the back loading ramp that folds up and down to allow people to come in and out of this helicopter. They had decided to keep it down for this flight. So basically, they had this huge opening that just looked straight down to the earth. But this is a very common thing in the military. Lots of helicopters, when they're flying around, have either a side door open or the back ramp down, because it provides an incredible view, and more importantly, it provides this amazing breeze inside of the cabin. A few minutes later, when the helicopter is way out over the Persian Gulf, Brian decides now is a good time to do this stunt. And so he looks across at the other side of the helicopter and kind of signals at the other 2 mechanics. It's super loud inside of the back of a helo, and so there's no way they could have spoken to each other besides with a headset, and they were not about to speak about this stunt over the headset because they didn't want the pilots to know. And so Brian signaled to the other 2 because they were totally in on his stunt he was about to do. And so they grinned, and one of them pulled out a camera to be ready for what he was going to do. And then Brian disconnected his helo lanyard. So inside of a military helicopter, you'll find all these metal eyelets, these little rings all over the floor, the walls, the ceiling, and these are there in order to attach cargo or strap things down, or to attach yourself, a person, inside of the helicopter. And so the way you do that is by using your helo lanyard. It's this belt you wear that has this special strap that comes off the front of it, and at the end of this 1 or 2 foot long strap is a carabiner, a clip, and you clip that onto any of those eyelets. And so that keeps you from flying out of the helicopter if the pilots need to maneuver suddenly, or if you lose altitude. Anything can happen inside. And so Brian removes his helo lanyard and then grabs this stretch of nylon rope. It was like a crudely built safety harness that kind of functioned like a helo lanyard, in the sense that there was a carabiner on one end, and on the other there was a way to attach it to yourself. But unlike it being this belt and kind of high-tech system that attached to him, it was really just kind of a slip knot on one end of this 10-foot long line. And so Brian most likely had built this 10-foot long safety harness for this particular stunt, or someone else had. But either way, he picks this up after detaching his helo lanyard, and he puts the loop end of this 10-foot line, the slip knot end, over his head down to his waist, and then cinched it tight. And then he very carefully stood up and walked towards the back of the helo, and then he clipped the end of this 10-foot line with the carabiner into one of the eyelets on the ground, right where the back ramp begins to go down. And so once that was in place, he turned and looked at the other 2 mechanics and gave them one more thumbs up, and then he got down on his hands and knees and he begins crawling backwards down the ramp. And so once he gets to the very edge of this ramp, so literally right behind him is just the open air. At that point, he grabs with his left hand one of those metal rings that are on the actual ramp itself. He gets a firm grip with one hand, and then with his right hand, he grabs the side of the ramp. There's some metal framing there. And so once he had a good grip and he felt confident in it, he kind of slowly lowered his lower half until it slipped off of the ramp. And as soon as it did, the winds outside the helicopter, the 120 120-mile-an-hour plus winds, they immediately swept his legs up and kind of held them in the air horizontal like he was flying. And so he's holding on to the back of the ramp, but his arms are kind of tucked up near his chest. But once he feels his legs up in the air, he slowly extends himself. And finally, when they were fully extended, he was officially doing the Superman stunt. This was called Supermaning, what he was doing. And as soon as he was in this position, the other crew members inside of the helicopter, they knew this was it. Let's take some pictures. And so one of them got their camera out and took some pictures of him. And Brian knows he's getting pictures taken. He's holding on as tight as he can. And then after the pictures were taken and Brian looked up and kind of got the thumbs up that he was good, he began trying to pull himself back into the helicopter, but he lost his grip. And as soon as he lost his grip, those 120-mile-an-hour plus winds, they whipped him backwards, and the safety harness that he had strapped around his waist, that's the only thing that caught him from flying away from the helicopter. And so Brian attempts to try to grab the ramp, but it's too far away, and as he's getting pulled by the wind away from the helicopter, that harness that was around his waist, it rides up until it stops right around his chest. And so at that point, he keeps his arms pinned by his side because he doesn't want the harness to slip up over his shoulders, because then he will fall to his death. But because this harness was self-tightening, as he was whipping in the winds, the wind was pulling him so hard away from the helicopter that it was tightening that loop around his chest. And so his chest got so tightly squeezed that it caused him to pass out. And as soon as that happened, his arms that were holding that harness in place, well, his arms went limp, and then the wind whipped his arms over his head, and the harness immediately slipped up over his shoulders, off his head, off his arms, and he went flying 125 feet all the way down to the water below, where he died. There were at least 8 people that were punished for this incident, including the 2 crew members in the back of the helicopter taking pictures, because they were totally in on this. But the details of the punishment.
Next story.
56-year-old Roger Miro grabbed a bag of trash from his apartment and then walked out into the hall. He turned right and walked down the hall until he reached the trash chute, which was right on the side of the wall. He opened it up. It was like a mailbox. He opened it up. He dropped his trash bag inside. He closed the trash chute and then walked back to his apartment. When he got back inside, he instinctively reached down to his right pocket to grab his cell phone, but it wasn't there. So he grabbed his left pocket, wasn't there either. He checked his back pockets, he's fishing around, and he realizes he doesn't have his phone. So he figures, okay, I must have put it down somewhere in my apartment. Now, Roger was legally blind, so it made looking for small things in his apartment quite difficult. But nonetheless, he began looking all over his apartment for his phone. He started in the kitchen, he looked all over the place, checked all the surfaces, no cell phone. He went to the living room, to the bedroom, to the bathroom, but there was no cell phone. And so Roger thought maybe when he walked to the trash chute, he might have dropped the phone in the hallway. And so he left his apartment, he turned right, and he walked along, retracing his footsteps all the way to the trash chute. But all along the way, there was no phone on the ground. And so as he's standing in front of the opening to this trash chute, he thinks to himself, maybe I accidentally put my phone in the trash bag that I have now just dropped down this trash chute. And so as Roger is standing there wondering what he's supposed to do, one of his neighbors walked out into the hall and looked down and saw Roger standing there kind of inquisitively looking at this opening to the trash chute. And they asked Roger, what's going on? And Roger explained the whole phone situation. And the neighbor said, well, hey, why don't you go down to the first floor and ask the manager if you can get the key to the trash room on the first floor where all the trash goes. And so Roger said, thank you very much. He turned and made his way to the elevator, and the neighbor went back inside of his apartment. Roger went down to the first floor. He went to the manager's office. He knocked on the door. And when the door opened, the manager was obviously very busy with something. And Roger would say, hey, I'm just looking to get into the trash room. I think I might have accidentally thrown my phone away. And I just want to have a look in the trash to see if I can find it. Now, this manager knew he was not allowed to let anybody who lived in the apartment complex go into that trash room on their own. It was a dangerous space. And so the manager was supposed to go in there with them if they needed to go in and look around in the trash. But right when Roger went up to the manager's office, the manager was waiting for a very important phone call and so couldn't really leave his office. But the manager kind of empathized with Roger and felt bad for him and said, okay, you know what? I'll just give you the key. You can go in there on your own and go looking for your cell phone. I hope you find it. And when you're done, just bring the key back here. And so Roger said, thank you very much. He took the key, he left the office, and he made his way down the hall to the trash room. And when he got there, he unlocked the lock and went inside. A few hours later, Roger's wife came home from work, and when she got to the apartment, Roger wasn't in there. She tried calling his cell phone, but he didn't pick up. And so she walked around the apartment hoping there would be some indication of where he might have gone, like a letter or something, but there was nothing. And so Roger's wife was really concerned about this because this was totally out of character for her husband to go out at night on his own. And so she, operating on a gut instinct, called the police and reported him missing. And so a few minutes later, 2 police officers show up at this apartment building. They go up to Roger's apartment, they speak to Roger's wife, and then they go into the hall and they knock on some doors of other neighbors in the area. And after speaking with them, one of the neighbors who had seen Roger earlier said, hey, he lost his phone, and the last I spoke to him, he was going to go down to the trash room to try to see if he could find his phone down there. And so the officers go down to the first floor, they go to the trash room, and they try the door, and it's unlocked. And when they open up the door and they look inside, right in the middle of this totally nondescript windowless room that basically looked like a basement, was this huge green dumpster. And above the green dumpster, high up on the ceiling, was this round opening. And that was the bottom of the trash chute. So when people like Roger and the other people who lived in this apartment building dropped their trash down their respective trash chute on each floor, the trash would come tumbling down and literally fall out of the ceiling into the dumpster. Now, this dumpster was unique. It was not like other dumpsters where the top was just wide open and anyone could lob a bag of trash in. No, this dumpster, only the left side of the dumpster had an opening for trash. The rest of the dumpster was completely welded shut. There was no way into it. And so on the left side, where this dumpster opened up to allow trash to come in, it was positioned right underneath that opening in the ceiling where the trash came tumbling down. And it wasn't just an opening. It was like this near vertical tunnel that was welded on to the top of this dumpster. And it went straight up and it had this big open mouth at the top, almost like a funnel. And it was there to catch the trash as it fell down, and it would go down this tunnel down into the dumpster. And so the gap between the ceiling and the top of this near vertical tunnel, this chute, was maybe 3 or 4 feet. And so when these officers looked into this room and they saw this dumpster and the chute and this hole in the ceiling, they also saw a ladder had been propped up on the left side of the dumpster right up against that near vertical tunnel, as if someone was trying to look down into the dumpster itself. And so one of the officers walked over, they climbed up the ladder, and when they looked down into this tunnel, down into the dumpster, they found Roger. After a lengthy investigation, this is what is believed to have happened to him. After Roger got that key from the manager, he went to the trash room, he opened it up, and then he went inside and found this huge dumpster. And he would have quickly realized the only way to look into the dumpster, and so to go looking for his phone, was to look down into this tunnel. There was a ladder nearby, so he grabbed it and he propped it up against the side of the dumpster, and he climbed up on top and he looked down into the tunnel, down into the dumpster, and as he was looking, either some trash from the ceiling fell down and struck him, causing him to lose his balance, or he just slipped somehow. But either way, he lost his balance and he tumbled into the tunnel, down into the dumpster. And what Roger didn't know is as soon as that happened, he was doomed. Because this was not some ordinary dumpster. This was a trash compactor. And as soon as Roger fell down that tunnel, his body triggered an electronic sensor that activated the trash compactor. And so the way this worked is there was this big metal ram inside the dumpster. There's a ram on one side, and once it gets activated, it will press. There's a hydraulic press that pushes it all the way to the other side. So any of the trash in this dumpster will get compressed against the other side of the dumpster. And then at that point, the ram comes all the way back. And so every time trash would come down that chute, it would trigger that sensor, the trash compactor would start, it would flatten the trash, and so on and so forth. And so Roger has fallen down into the dumpster, he's triggered this compactor, but he's legally blind, he's probably dazed from the fall, and so by the time he realizes what's going on and he's kind of looking around, there is a hydraulic press bearing down on him. And so he probably tried to jump up the tunnel to try to escape the dumpster, but there was no ladder inside this tunnel and it was nearly vertical, so there was no way to climb up and out of it. And inside of the dumpster itself, there was no emergency shutoff switch and there was no emergency exit. And so at some point, it's assumed that Roger realized he was not going to be able to climb up the tunnel. And so he only had one direction he could go, which was to retreat to the far side of the dumpster, as far away from the press as he possibly could be. But once he got over there, there was nowhere for him to go. And so he was forced to just wait as this hydraulic press slowly moved across until it finally reached him and crushed him. Now, we don't know if that very first hydraulic press actually killed Roger. All we know is Roger was trapped inside of this dumpster for several hours, and over that period of time, more and more trash was dropped down the chute, activating the press over and over and over again. And so by the time the police actually looked down into the dumpster, they saw a part of Roger's body, and immediately they could tell there was nothing they could do. Roger was definitely deceased. Roger's wife would sue the manager of the apartment building as well as the company that owned the apartment building for their negligence, but the outcomes of that case.
Next story.
2016, a professor was sitting outside in his backyard during a torrential thunderstorm. The sky was black, rain and hail were falling everywhere, and all around him, all he could hear were countless sirens. The city was in the middle of a full-scale disaster. But this 21st, 2016, Jody Santoro, who was a 21-year-old mother in Melbourne, Australia, woke up to the sound of her 4-month-old son crying. Outside, there was this horrible thunderstorm going on. All this rain and hail were pelting the roof, and the wind was so strong that all the windows in the house were rattling. Jody reached over and grabbed her phone on the nightstand and checked the time, and she saw right away that she had overslept. However, it had been a really hot day that day, and she was so drained from the heat and also taking care of a 4-month-old that she wasn't really surprised she had overslept. But as the sound of her son's cries intensified, Jody knew, no matter how tired she was, she needed to get up and go tend to him. But the instant her legs swung off the bed and she actually tried to stand up, she knew something was wrong, and it had nothing to do with being tired. She had this incredible sense of dizziness come over her, and then her chest suddenly tightened up to the point where she could barely even breathe in. She found herself grabbing the bed just to steady herself. However, as alarming as this was, Jody didn't panic. She knew this feeling. She had been dealing with asthma for years, and she knew this was the start of an asthma attack. And so Jody reached over for her inhaler on the nightstand. She picked it up, brought it to her lips, pressed it down, and then took in a measured breath of the medication, expecting to pretty much immediately feel relief. But she didn't. The inhaler wasn't working. Jody again pressed down the inhaler harder this time and took a bigger breath in, hoping that a bit more medication might do the trick. But again, it just was not working. And so now with panic rising inside of her, she's, still struggling to breathe. Her son is still freaking out and she can't tend to him. And all she was thinking is, I have to get my nebulizer, which is basically a more robust version of an inhaler. It provides more medication more quickly into your body. However, the nebulizer, which was just over in her closet, required some setup. And she knew she felt so frantic right now and she was shaking so much that she didn't think she'd be able to set it up or even set it up in time before she passed out. Just then, her fiance walked into the bedroom, drawn there by the sound of their son crying. But the second he walked in, his attention was not on their son, it was instead on Jody, who by now was clutching the bed and kind of hobbled over and very clearly having some sort of medical emergency. Jody turned to him and began to say, I can't breathe. But her fiance already knew she had asthma. He knew what these attacks looked like. And so without even needing to be told, he rushed to the closet, set up her nebulizer, and then put the mask right over her face. And as soon as it was, Jody took in the biggest inhale she possibly could, really believing this was going to stop the asthma attack. But just like the inhaler, the nebulizer didn't work. It felt like with every breath she was taking, her lungs were shrinking, not expanding. And so Jody turned to her fiance and croaked out, "Call an ambulance," her voice barely audible. And so her fiance, who also was now beginning to panic, grabbed the phone, and as he was talking to the dispatcher, trying to relay all the details of what was happening, outside this thunderstorm was only getting worse and worse. The hail and the rain were battering the sides of the house, and all the windows were shaking. I mean, it was absolute bedlam inside of this house. The next few minutes were torture for Jody. She laid on the bed waiting for paramedics. Her breaths at this point were so small, so shallow, like she knew she was about to pass out any second. And then finally the paramedics rushed inside. She knew there were 2 people in the room, but it was so chaotic. And all she could say when they showed up in the room was, "I'm going to die. I'm going to die." The paramedics lifted her off the bed, they put her on the gurney, and as they wheeled her out the door towards the ambulance, her world went totally black. We're all looking for a fresh start this time of the year. Whether it's trying to eat better or lose weight, we all have some bad habits we're trying to stop and some good habits we're trying to start. Well, make this the year that you finally start to get out from being under that crushing debt. And the first step to doing that is contacting PDS Debt for a personalized solution. Before I became Mr. Ballen, my wife and I definitely struggled financially and definitely fell into some debt. Had we had PDS Debt at the time, I would imagine that would have made our lives a whole lot easier. PDS Debt has customized options for anybody struggling with credit cards, personal loans, collections, or medical bills. If you're making payments every month on your debt and your debt is still not going down, PDS Debt has solutions for you. PDS Debt strives to understand your specific scenario to help provide alternative solutions to becoming debt-free. Everyone with $10,000 or more of eligible debt qualifies, and there is no minimum credit score required. Save more while paying off your debt in a fraction of the time. Make this the year you take control of your debt. Get a free debt analysis right now at pdsdebt.com/MrBallen. It only takes 30 seconds. Again, that is pdsdebt.com/MrBallen. Okay, back to the story. The paramedics rushed Jody to Sunshine Hospital, and on the way, they tried to stabilize her by squeezing these oxygen bags, forcing oxygen into Jody's lungs. And as they were doing that, Jody's fiance was following the ambulance right behind, white-knuckling the steering wheel, praying his fiance was going to survive this asthma attack. When the ambulance finally arrived at Sunshine Hospital, the emergency room was mayhem. Paramedics quickly wheeled Jody in on her gurney, shouting out her vital signs to the doctors waiting near the door. Her fiance, meanwhile, watched helplessly as the medical staff surrounded her and inserted IV lines, hooked up monitors, and began intubating her to force even more oxygen into her lungs. But fortunately, this rapid medical intervention, once Jody got to the hospital, appeared to work, because not long after getting there, Jody did begin to stabilize, not enough to suggest that she was actually all better, but her condition basically began to improve. However, the moment she began to improve, instead of the medical team, talking to her and figuring out what happened and making sure she really was on a path to recovery here, instead, the medical team literally ran out of her room, back out to the front of the ER, because by this point, the Sunshine Hospital ER was overflowing with patients. There were all these people in the waiting room and also outside, and basically everybody had the same symptoms as Jody. They couldn't breathe. There were people slumped on the ground against the wall, screaming for help. I mean, the medical team was totally overwhelmed. And on top of that, there were ambulances literally lined up around the block waiting to drop off patients. There just wasn't any more space. But nonetheless, doctors and nurses and the medical team at the hospital worked furiously, moving from one patient to the next, sometimes in an exam room, sometimes out in the waiting room, sometimes outside. It's wherever the patients were. But the weird thing is all these people, they had the same symptoms, these severe asthma attacks, yet many of the people that were showing up had never had asthma in their lives before. So how was this happening? This went on for hours and hours. And really, the situation in the hospital only continued to get worse, with more and more and more patients showing up with worse and worse symptoms. And so during this madness, Jody, who really hadn't gotten better, she just stabilized, she actually was moved out of the emergency room and over to the ICU, pretty much just to create one more space for new patients. And so in the ICU, Jody's fiance sat next to her, gripping her hand, listening to the sound of the monitors beeping steadily all around her. Outside the room, he could see doctors and nurses and medical staff sprinting up and down the hallways, looking frantic and worried. He had no idea what was happening here. He just hoped Jody would be okay. But it would turn out there actually was someone who knew exactly what was going on. A university researcher named Philip Taylor had actually predicted this the day before. Professor Taylor was an expert in atmospheric allergens, a field so niche that barely anybody outside of his small research circle had even heard of it. And so on the afternoon of November 20th, the day before, Taylor had been at home in his office analyzing data when he noticed something very alarming. All of the ingredients for a catastrophic event were aligning in the forecast, and the patterns were so precise that it stopped him cold. Taylor was stunned. He'd spent years studying the effects of weather on public health, but he'd never seen anything like this before. And at the same time, Taylor also realized that as alarming as this was, very few other people, if anybody, would see this as a problem. He was like the one person in the world that had the expertise to see how catastrophic this might actually be. And so desperate to warn others, he wound up posting a very urgent announcement on this weather website that he managed. But unfortunately, it just wasn't seen by enough people in time. And so now, as hospitals all across Melbourne overflowed with people gasping for air, Taylor sat in his backyard watching the storm unfold. The sky was pitch black, rain and hail was coming down, the wind was whipping, and off in the distance, all he could hear was thunder and sirens. And he knew, unfortunately, his prediction had been right. Just like Professor Taylor's weather models had predicted, on November 21st, 2016, Melbourne, Australia was hit by an extremely rare event known as thunderstorm asthma. This deadly phenomenon can only occur when three very specific weather conditions align. 1, high heat during the day. 2, a very powerful thunderstorm. And 3, extremely high pollen levels. Melbourne's heat that day had caused unusually high concentrations of ryegrass pollen to hang in the air. And then when that huge thunderstorm rolled in, the intense humidity, the wind, and the rain shattered the pollen grains into microscopic fragments. And then these tiny particles, which were way smaller than regular pollen, were carried by this storm deep into people's homes and into their lungs. Unlike normal pollen, these microscopic fragments bypassed the body's typical defenses and embedded themselves deep into people's lungs, causing severe and sudden asthma attacks. Now, for people who already had asthma, this was catastrophic. But even perfectly healthy people found themselves gasping for air, overwhelmed by the sheer density of this microscopic pollen. The storm had essentially made the air everybody in Melbourne was breathing deadly. As for Jody Santoro, she would spend days in the ICU, hooked up to monitors, with machines pumping oxygen into her lungs while her body fought to heal. But she was lucky. She would eventually recover. And in the days that followed, she would learn the full scale of what actually happened in Melbourne. Nearly 10,000 people had flooded the hospitals across Australia, complaining of the same symptoms that Jody did. And unfortunately, of those 10,000, 10 people actually lost their lives, and many of them were totally healthy and had never had an asthma attack in their lives before. For Jody, despite surviving this ordeal, the awful memory of what happened on that night will forever be on her mind. She is now all too aware.
Next story.
Along with his partner, were driving in his police cruiser near the Spanish Fork River in Utah when suddenly a police dispatcher came on over the radio. And this dispatcher was speaking very urgently and said, "Hey, a fisherman has just called in to say that he spotted what looks like an upturned SUV partially submerged in the Spanish Fork River right underneath the bridge. And whoever is closest to this bridge, get over there and see if there's anybody inside the vehicle that can be saved." And so Officer Beddoes and his partner, they knew they were very near this bridge. And so immediately they banged a U-turn, they drove to the bridge, but from the road, they looked down and couldn't see any SUV. But they saw there were some firefighters and paramedics that were also converging at the spot on the road, and everybody's getting out and running down to the riverbank. And so Beddoes and his partner did the same thing. They got out and they ran down. And then finally, when they got to the riverbank and they saw underneath this bridge, sure enough, there was this red SUV upturned, partially submerged. And he noticed right away that none of the doors had been opened in this SUV. And so it meant whoever was driving this vehicle when it flipped over very likely was still inside. And so Officer Beddoes and his partner and the other first responders just jumped into this icy cold river and began making their way closer and closer to this upturned SUV, which again, it's not fully submerged. It's like a third of the way underwater. So if you were sitting in the seat inside of this vehicle and you were an adult, your head would basically be in the water if you were still strapped into the seat. And as they're making their way towards this SUV, when they got close enough, they began hearing a woman inside of the vehicle screaming, "Hey, we're in here! Come over here, help!" But when Officer Beddoes and the rest of the first responders actually reached the SUV, the water was so murky and it basically completely covered up the windows that they weren't really able to look into the vehicle. They could just hear this woman yelling, but that was it. And then when they tried to open up the doors, they couldn't do it because the roof had begun to cave in, and so the actual framing of the door wouldn't open. And so all these first responders, it's like their adrenaline's pumping and they're like, come on, we got to push this thing up onto its side so we can get in. And so all these first responders are pushing, and slowly but surely they began to raise the side of this vehicle up until the windows suddenly were clear, and Officer Beddoes and the others were able to look into the car, and they saw there was a woman in the driver's seat, and there was a baby in a car seat dangling upside down in the back seat, still strapped in. And so Beddoes began screaming, there's a baby in here, there's a baby in here. And suddenly it was like everybody got extra strength and they pushed this vehicle all the way up onto its side. And then one of the firefighters climbed up onto the side of the car, which now was the highest point of the car. And he reached in and he clipped the straps holding the baby who had been upside down, dangling there, cut the straps and pulled the baby out and handed the baby over to Officer Beddoes. And then the firefighter began doing the same thing to get the woman out. But Officer Beddoes, at this point, he just took this baby, he turned away, he figured the first responders will handle this woman, and he's going to take this baby to safety, because he couldn't even tell if the baby was alive or not. And so he's cradling this baby, he's rushing back through the water, back to the riverbank, and then he hands the baby over to the paramedics, and right as he does, he sees this little baby begins to move its arms and flicker its eyes, and he wanted to weep out of relief that this child was okay. They put the baby onto a stretcher, they put the baby in the ambulance, and they whisked the baby away to the hospital where this baby would survive. But after the baby had been taken away, Officer Beddoes turned his attention back to the SUV and back to the woman to see how she was doing, but he could tell right away from the way people were acting, all the other first responders that were still dealing with the crisis in the water, the way they were acting indicated that something is off here. Well, it would turn out 14 hours earlier, so at around 10 p.m. the previous night, a 28-year-old woman named Jennifer Gorsbeck had just left her father's house in Salem, Utah, and in her car was her little 18-month-old baby, Lily, who was in the back seat. And after Jennifer pulled away from her father's house and her father's on the porch waving to her, she began driving towards her home. But something happened around 10:30 p.m. that night. We don't know what, but something caused Jennifer to careen off the road on that bridge and flip over and land in the water. Maybe she fell asleep at the wheel or an animal jumped out, we don't know, but we know at 10:30 she careens off the bridge and she lands in that river. And then for 14 hours, she and her baby remained upside down in that river. Until finally, Officer Beddoes and the other first responders came rushing over to open it up and get them out of there. And if you recall, all the first responders, Officer Beddoes included, heard Jennifer screaming that they were in the car, come save us, please. But what they would find out is that could not have been Jennifer, because Jennifer was killed on impact when the car fell into the water. Only Lily survived the crash, and then Lily, who's nearly hypothermic and she's upside down with water like 2 inches away from her head, for 14 hours she dangled there, and when she was pulled out, according to doctors, was like a couple of minutes before she would have died from hypothermia. And so without that voice, Lily almost certainly would have died, because it was the sound of that voice that really encouraged all these first responders to find the strength and get that car up on its side and then get the baby out of there. We don't know whose voice that belonged to, but for sure, it saved Lily's life. And again, baby Lily would make a full recovery, and to this day, Officer Beddoes and the other first responders, they know what they heard, and